Hi everyone, if you enjoy this content, please like the video, leave a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe to stay updated, and let's get started. Picture America in the mid-1800s. It wasn't yet the roaring, industrial giant it would become, but it wasn't the scrappy little republic of 1776 either. It was a teenager of a nation, restless, growing fast, full of energy, but prone to mood swings that could turn ugly. The population had exploded since the Revolution. In 1800, there were just over 5 million people living between the Atlantic and the Mississippi River. By 1850, more than 23 million, nearly 5 times as many. That boom wasn't just from big families, though frontier families could rival any modern TV family in size. Waves of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and later Scandinavia brought new languages, foods, and skills into the mix. If you're walking the streets of New York, Philadelphia, or Boston, you might hear English, German, and Gaelic within the same block. The economy was diversifying, too. Railroads, new, noisy, and downright revolutionary, were stretching their iron arms across the countryside. Factories hummed in the north, while merchant ships crowded busy ports. Farmers, meanwhile, were still the backbone of the economy, producing everything from wheat in Ohio to tobacco in Virginia. And the frontier? It still called to dreamers and desperates alike, promising cheap land but also a hard life. Politically, the nation was loud and unruly. Campaigns were rowdy affairs, often more like carnivals than the carefully staged events we know today. Speeches ran long, insults flew freely, and newspapers took sides without pretending otherwise. The U.S. was big enough now to feel powerful, but there was an undercurrent of fragility. The states didn't always see themselves as one people. In fact, sometimes it seemed they were just loosely cooperating until one side had finally had enough. You could travel from Boston to Charleston in 1855 and feel like you'd crossed not just 1,000 miles, but a cultural ocean. The North and South weren't just regions. They were worlds apart. In the North, cities were growing at a dizzying pace. Immigration fed this growth, with Irish laborers digging canals and German craftsmen filling workshops. Factories churn out textiles, tools, and rail equipment. Urban life meant bustling streets, crowded tenements, and a sense that the future was arriving fast. The South was another story. Its wealth was rooted in the soil. Vast plantations worked by enslaved laborers. Cotton, rice, sugar, and tobacco brought in fortunes for a small elite. Society there was more rural, more spread out, and slower to change. Towns were smaller, rail lines fewer, and industry limited. If the North was looking toward a mechanized future, the South was holding tight to an agricultural past. This wasn't just about economics. It shaped people's worldviews. In the North, where factories needed cheap labor, immigrants became part of the workforce. In the South, immigration barely touched the social structure. Labor was already coerced and inherited through slavery. Northerners often thought Southerners were clinging to a dying system. Southerners thought Northerners were arrogant meddlers who didn't understand their way of life. Geography had something to do with it, too. The South's long, warm growing seasons made plantation agriculture profitable. The North's harsher winters and rocky soil made large-scale slavery less practical. So while both regions depended on each other's goods, they were living in parallel realities, linked by trade, divided by culture. King Cotton wasn't just a slogan, it was the truth. By the mid-1800s, cotton was the lifeblood of the Southern economy. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had turbocharged production, making it far easier to process cotton fiber and meet growing demand. By 1860, the South was producing 2/3 of the world's cotton. This white gold didn't just feed Southern wealth, it fed Northern industry. Northern textile mills relied on Southern cotton to keep their machines running. Shipping companies, insurance firms, and banks in New York and Boston all profited from the trade. The irony? While Northerners might rail against slavery, many of their businesses quietly depended on it. Globally, the stakes were just as high. Britain's textile industry was hooked on Southern cotton. That gave the South an inflated sense of power. Some leaders even believed that Britain would side with them in any conflict just to protect its supply. But this over-reliance on a single crop was risky. A bad harvest, a blockade, or political upheaval could send the whole system crashing. The Cotton Kingdom was more than an economy. It was an identity. Planter families measured their status by acres and slaves owned. Wealth was concentrated in a small elite, but their influence was outsized. They dominated Southern politics, set cultural norms, and defended slavery as not just an economic necessity, but a moral good. That last part would put them on a collision course with the North. While the South's white elite built fortunes, millions of enslaved men, women, and children paid the price. Their lives were defined by hard labor, strict control, and constant vulnerability. In the fields, work was grueling and endless. From sunup to sundown, enslaved people planted, tended, and harvested crops under the watchful eyes of overseers. In some cases, enslaved workers in towns might be hired out as blacksmiths, carpenters, or cooks, but their wages went to their owners. Family was both a source of strength and heartbreak. Enslaved people formed deep bonds, marrying, though not legally recognized, and raising children. But at any moment, those families could be torn apart by sale. The fear of being sold down the river to harsher conditions in the Deep South hung over every home. Resistance took many forms. Some ran away, risking capture and brutal punishment. Others slowed work, broke tools, or feigned illness. A few led uprisings, like Nat Turner in 1831, though such revolts were met with deadly force. Even small acts, teaching someone to read, holding secret religious meetings, were ways of claiming humanity in a system built to deny it. The psychological toll was immense, not only for the enslaved, but also for those who enforced the system. To keep slavery alive, white Southerners had to justify it morally and politically. That meant weaving it into religion, law, and culture, a moral corrosion that seeped into every level of society. Slavery wasn't just a Southern issue. It was a national problem, and the political system was constantly patching over it with uneasy deals. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the map, balancing free and slave states. The Compromise of 1850 tried to settle disputes over new territories after the Mexican-American War. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 basically tossed previous agreements aside, letting settlers vote on slavery, a recipe for violence. Each compromise was supposed to buy peace, but really it just postponed the inevitable. The Fugitive Slave Act, part of the 1850 deal, enraged Northerners by forcing them to help capture escaped slaves. Bleeding Kansas, the bloody mini-civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, showed that paper agreements couldn't stop real conflict. By the 1850s, Congress was a battleground. Senators shouted, threatened, even fought, most famously when Representative Preston Brooks beat Senator Charles Sumner nearly to death on the Senate floor in 1856. That wasn't just a bad day in politics. It was a sign the center couldn't hold much longer. Even outside politics, the North and South were pulling apart in ways that went beyond economics. Religion was one. The Second Great Awakening, a wave of religious revival, had inspired moral reform movements in the North, including abolitionism. In the South, religion was used to defend slavery, with some preachers claiming it was divinely sanctioned. Education was another dividing line. Public schooling was expanding in the North, with Massachusetts leading the way. The South lagged behind, relying more on private tutors for wealthy families and offering little to no formal education for poor whites, let alone enslaved people, for whom literacy was often illegal. Then there was the media. Newspapers and pamphlets were weapons in the growing war of words. Northern papers published accounts of slave auctions and brutal punishments. Southern papers painted abolitionists as dangerous radicals bent on destroying the South's way of life. The printing press didn't just spread information, it amplified outrage. Regional pride fed into all of this. To be called a Yankee in the South was an insult. In the North, it was a badge of honor. Southerners saw themselves as more refined, more traditional, more tied to the land. Northerners saw themselves as progressive, industrious, and morally superior. When both sides believe they're the real America, trouble's coming. By the late 1850s, the country was a powder keg. You could feel the tension in every debate, every newspaper headline. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 sent shockwaves through the South, convincing many that abolitionists would stop at nothing. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, without a single Southern electoral vote, was the final signal to some that the Union no longer worked. Yet daily life went on. Farmers planted crops, shopkeepers rang up sales, children played in yards. People married, moved west, and made plans for the future. That's the strange thing about history. You can live through the calm just before catastrophe and not realize how close it is. The first shots hadn't been fired yet, but the arguments, the laws, the cultural battles, they'd already laid the groundwork. The storm was coming, and when it broke, it would reshape the nation forever. Let's give more context on the election in autumn of 1860. The United States went to the polls not just to choose a president, but, though few admitted it outright, to decide whether the country itself would keep existing as one nation. The ballots were more like litmus tests of loyalty than simple votes. The political map wasn't red and blue yet, but it might as well have been. The field was crowded and fractured. Abraham Lincoln stood for the brand new Republican Party, with its platform of stopping slaveries spread westward. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas carried the Northern Democrats' banner, preaching popular sovereignty, the idea that each territory should vote on slavery themselves. Southern Democrats, furious with Douglas for not defending their institution outright, ran their own man, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, on a platform that left no wiggle room. Slavery was a constitutional right in all territories. Then there was John Bell of Tennessee, the constitutional union candidate, appealing to voters who just wanted the whole argument to stop before it tore the country apart. If this sounds like a recipe for chaos, it was. The 1860 election was less a debate over issues than a mirror showing how deeply America had split along sectional lines. Lincoln didn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states. In the Deep South, his name might as well have been a foreign word. And yet, when the votes were counted, Lincoln swept the North and West with just under 40% of the popular vote. Thanks to the Electoral College and the divided opposition, that was enough to hand him the presidency. Not a single electoral vote came from the South. Zero. The message to many Southerners was as clear as it was alarming. A president could now be elected without any Southern input. Their voice in the Union, they feared, had been permanently muted. That fear wasn't born in a vacuum. For years, Southern politicians had warned that the balance of power was slipping, that population growth in the North and new free states in the West would eventually make the South irrelevant in national politics. Lincoln's win felt like the prophecy fulfilled. And Lincoln himself? He was still a political unknown to much of the nation. Sure, they'd heard of his debates with Douglas, his House-divided speech. But to many Southerners, he wasn't a flesh-and-blood man. They saw him as a symbol of Northern hostility, a caricature drawn by hostile newspapers. They weren't waiting to see what he'd actually do in office. In their eyes, the very fact of his election was an existential threat. The shockwave from Election Day hit South Carolina first and hardest. If the South was a powder keg, Charleston was its smoldering fuse. The state's political class had been threatening secession for decades, most famously during the nullification crisis of the 1830s. Back then, federal troops had stayed the hand. But in December 1860, the mood was different. On December 20th, delegates to South Carolina's secession convention met in Charleston's Institute Hall. The vote was unanimous. The state was leaving the Union. Church bells pealed across the city. Cannons fired in the harbor. Bands played Dixie in the streets. To supporters, it felt like Independence Day too. Zero. But for every cheering crowd, there were quiet households where the mood was far from celebratory. Merchants who traded with northern firms wondered if contracts would still be honored. Families with sons in the U.S. Army worried about what side they'd be ordered to fight on. Enslaved people, watching from the sidelines, had their own hopes and fears, many silently wishing that Northern resolve might bring them freedom, though they knew the road would be dangerous and long. South Carolina's declaration of the immediate causes read like a legal brief, citing the North's hostility to slavery as the primary grievance. It was blunt, unapologetic, and aimed squarely at the Republican platform, and it was meant to be contagious. Contagious it was. Within weeks, the secession fever rolled west and south like a weather front. Mississippi left the Union on January 9, 1861, followed by Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and finally Texas in early February. The speed was staggering. This wasn't a case of state legislatures fumbling through drawn-out debates. These conventions were called and concluded with alarming swiftness. Politicians who had been pushing for separation for years suddenly found the political climate perfect. Telegraph wires crackled with reports of new declarations, each one emboldening the next. And yet, not everyone was swept up in the tide. In some southern towns, especially in the Appalachian uplands, Unionist sentiment ran strong. Small farmers without large slaveholdings saw the wealthy planter elite steering the ship toward war for their own interests. But those voices were quickly drowned out in the official record. By February 1861, representatives from the seceded states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, to do something that felt almost absurd: create a new country on paper while still technically part of the old one. The Confederate States of America was born with its own constitution, strikingly similar to the U.S. Constitution, except with explicit protections for slavery and stronger state sovereignty. They needed a president, and the choice fell to Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. Davis didn't leap at the role. He later said it felt more like a summons to a grave duty than a political triumph. But he accepted, knowing that the road ahead was almost certainly going to be one of conflict. It's worth noting that this new nation was forming without yet controlling a single federal fort or arsenal on its claimed soil. On paper, they had sovereignty. In reality, U.S. authority still existed in the South, at least for the moment. If you picture the North in early 1861 as a solid wall of patriotic unity, you'd be wrong. Yes, there were abolitionists and staunch Unionists ready to fight to preserve the country. But there were also plenty who hoped the South could simply be let go, avoiding war entirely. Business interests worried about losing Southern cotton and markets. Immigrant communities, especially in cities like New York, feared war would mean conscription and economic upheaval. In the Midwest, grain merchants thought less about slavery and more about keeping the Mississippi River open to trade. Even within Lincoln's own Republican Party, there were shades of disagreement. Some were prepared to compromise on slavery's expansion to keep the Union intact. Others believed any concession would make the whole Republican experiment meaningless. In Washington, the lame duck Congress scrambled to find a way out. The most notable attempt was the Crittenden Compromise, named for Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden. His proposal would have restored the old Missouri Compromise line across the territories, guaranteeing slavery south of it forever. To Southern secessionists, this was too little, too late. They doubted the North would honor it. To Lincoln and most Republicans, it was unacceptable, as it would have allowed slavery to expand. Lincoln held firm in private letters. "I will suffer death before I will consent or advise my friends to consent to any concession or compromise which looks like buying the privilege of taking possession of this government." The Crittenden Plan died in committee. Other half measures, like the proposed Corwin Amendment, which would have constitutionally protected slavery where it already existed, passed the House but came too late to change secession's course. By March 1861, the gap between North and South was no longer political. It was physical. Two capitals, two presidents, two constitutions. And in between them sat federal forts, arsenals, and post offices that each side claimed. Lincoln's journey from Illinois to Washington was symbolic and tense. His route was planned to rally support, but it was also shadowed by rumors of assassination plots. Pinkerton detectives even smuggled him through Baltimore at night to avoid danger. When he took the oath of office on March 4th, he stood before a divided country already halfway to war. The inaugural address pleaded for unity. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. But less than 6 weeks later, cannons in Charleston Harbor would answer that plea with fire. No one, North or South, truly grasped that the war ahead would last 4 years, kill over 600,000 Americans, and leave scars that a century wouldn't erase. In December 1860, it all still felt like a political crisis. By April 1861, it would be something far bloodier. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol, hat in hand, his tall frame cutting a sharp figure against the crisp early spring sky. Washington, D.C., wasn't exactly brimming with celebration that day. The air felt heavy, like a room where two people had just been arguing but hadn't said everything they wanted to say. The Capitol dome itself was unfinished, a not-so-subtle reminder that the country beneath it was also incomplete, maybe even in danger of coming apart entirely. 7 states had already declared they were done with the Union. They hadn't just sent strongly worded letters. They formed their own government in Montgomery, Alabama, with Jefferson Davis as president. The map was literally changing before Lincoln even put his hand on the Bible. Yet, there he was, promising in his inaugural address not to start a war. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't surrender either. It was more like a stubborn declaration. The Union is perpetual, it can't just be walked away from, and I will do my job to keep it together. Lincoln's words carried the weight of a man who understood both the law and human nature. He spoke directly to the South, insisting that they had no legal right to secede, but also reminding them that we are not enemies, but friends. That's the part newspapers up north like to quote. Southern papers, meanwhile, often skipped straight to the lines where he made it clear he intended to hold federal property, which in their eyes meant forts, arsenals, and custom houses on their soil. Here's the thing. Lincoln was trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. He had to look strong enough to keep border states like Virginia and Kentucky from bolting, but not so aggressive that he pushed the Deep South into a shooting war. He'd been in office for a few hours and already, every word he said was being dissected, cheered, and cursed, sometimes in the same newspaper edition, depending on which column you read. Out on the streets, the mood depended entirely on where you stood, physically and politically. In Boston, there was relief, even hope, that Lincoln might keep the country intact. In Charleston, South Carolina, the feeling was more like a town just waiting for the first thunderclap of a storm they'd been predicting for months. Ordinary people could sense it. Merchants talked about trade routes shifting. Dock workers talked about war as if it were already penciled into next week's schedule. And just offshore, sitting stubbornly in Charleston Harbor, was a small, stubborn piece of federal real estate that was about to become the center of everyone's attention. Fort Sumter. It's worth remembering that in 1861, presidents didn't have the luxury of immediate spin control. There was no CNN fact-check crawl, no Twitter thread clarifying his points, no press secretary handing out bullet points. Lincoln's message had to travel by telegraph and by type, and every editor had their own angle. By the time his speech reached the far corners of the country, it wasn't one speech anymore. It was half a dozen different versions, each colored by the political ink in which it was printed. And that, right there, was the problem. Lincoln wasn't just dealing with a divided country. He was dealing with multiple realities of the same country. The Union he vowed to preserve was already splintering not just along state lines, but in the minds of its people. Charleston, South Carolina, in early 1861, was a strange mix of normal life and looming crisis. The city was still bustling. Carriages clattered over cobblestones, cotton bales were hauled to the docks, and the market stalls were stocked with rice, seafood, and gossip. But beneath that everyday rhythm, you could feel the tension. It was in the clipped tone of merchants talking politics, in the way crowds gathered around newspaper postings, in the too long glances out toward the water. Because there, in the middle of the harbor like a stubborn guest who wouldn't leave, sat Fort Sumter. It wasn't just a fort. It was federal property. It was a symbol. And in the minds of many Charlestonians, it was a provocation, a stone reminder that secession or not, the U.S. government still had a footprint in South Carolina. Major Robert Anderson commanded the Union garrison, but his situation was awkward from the start. His men had originally been stationed at Fort Moultrie, a much older, more vulnerable fort on the edge of Sullivan's Island. In late December 1860, right after South Carolina's secession, Anderson quietly moved his troops to Fort Sumter. He did it at night, under cover of darkness, without a single shot fired. It was a calculated move. Sumter was stronger, more defensible, and harder for the Confederates to seize without an outright attack. Of course, to Southern eyes, that wasn't strategic repositioning. That was an insult, a dare, a line in the sand. From that moment, Fort Sumter became a chessboard square neither side wanted to concede. The Confederates surrounded it with batteries on nearby islands, Sullivan's, James, Morris, all bristling with cannons aimed at the fort's brick walls. The harbor, usually a place of commerce, had quietly turned into a fortified stage set, waiting for someone to speak the first line. Meanwhile, life inside Fort Sumter was uncomfortable. Anderson's men were cut off from supplies except what could be ferried in, and even those runs were risky. They rationed food, patched uniforms, and kept the fort's guns in working order, just in case. Letters home spoke of dreary monotony mixed with constant expectation, which is just a more polite way of saying boredom with a side of dread. Lincoln's government in Washington knew the fort couldn't hold out forever without resupply, but sending reinforcements risked being seen as an act of war. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership, on the other hand, couldn't just let the fort sit there indefinitely, not without looking weak to their own citizens and the other Southern states that had joined the Confederacy. And so, Charleston Harbor became the physical embodiment of the larger national crisis. Neither side wanted to start a war, but neither side could back down without losing face. Every passing week in the spring of 1861 was like twisting a key tighter in a wind-up clock. Sooner or later, the spring would snap. It's almost eerie reading the local papers from that time. In one column, you might see news about a church fundraiser or a shipment of coffee arriving from Brazil. In another, you'd find fiery editorials about removing the invader from the harbor. The everyday and the extraordinary were living side by side, just waiting for a spark to catch. If you were standing in Charleston in March 1861, you could almost convince yourself nothing had to happen. The weather was soft, the azaleas were starting to bloom, and ships still came and went in the harbor. But the calm was an illusion. Inside Charleston's telegraph office, messages were flying back and forth like frantic birds, carrying terse words between Montgomery, Washington, and the officers on the water. Major Robert Anderson's garrison at Fort Sumter was running low on everything except resolve. The men had cut their rations. They were down to salt pork, hardtack, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a musket barrel. Even basic things, candles, uniforms, firewood, were getting scarce. Anderson knew they couldn't hold out indefinitely, but he also knew abandoning the fort without a fight would be a gift to Confederate morale. Lincoln, just weeks into his presidency, was trapped in a political riddle. If he sent a warship with troops and ammunition, it would look like an act of aggression. If he let Sumter fall without lifting a finger, it would look like weakness and might push the border states into the Confederate camp. So he came up with something in between: send supplies, not soldiers, and announce it publicly. His message to the governor of South Carolina was straightforward. Food and non-military aid were coming. If the Confederates fired on that shipment, it would be their choice to start a war. Down in Montgomery, Jefferson Davis read those words with little patience. The Confederate president understood the stakes perfectly. If Lincoln succeeded in resupplying Sumter, the Union flag would keep flying in Charleston Harbor, and the South's new government would look powerless. Davis had spent his career as a military man and a politician. He knew perception mattered almost as much as the battlefield itself. So, orders went out. If the Union tried to resupply the fort, stop them. And if it came to it, take the fort by force. Meanwhile, Charleston was holding its breath. Cannons along the harbor were tested and retested. Powder was dried in the sun to make sure it wouldn't misfire. Soldiers drilled in view of the fort, partly for readiness, partly to send a message. The local papers printed confident boasts about how quickly Sumter could be reduced to rubble. But in private, even some Confederates admitted it wouldn't be so simple. Anderson was a professional, and Sumter was built to withstand a beating. What's fascinating is how personal it became. Officers on both sides sometimes knew each other from West Point or from the Mexican-American War. Letters show a kind of strained courtesy, as if they were all hoping someone else would be the one to break the stalemate. But every day the fort stayed in Union hands made that courtesy harder to maintain. In Washington, Lincoln's cabinet split into hawks and doves. Some pushed for a show of force. Others warned it would unite the entire South against the Union. The debate dragged on, but time didn't. The clock was ticking louder with each ration eaten at Fort Sumter. By early April, everyone knew a decision was imminent. The resupply ships were on their way. Confederate batteries had their orders. The city of Charleston, merchants, dockhands, society women, free black workers, enslaved laborers, all of them could feel the hum in the air. It was the sound of patience wearing out. And patience, as history shows, is a fragile thing. The first boom came at 4:30 a.m. on a Friday morning. Most of Charleston was still asleep when the flash from Fort Johnson lit up the darkness and the deep thud of the mortar rolled across the harbor. That single shell arced high, a glowing ember against the pre-dawn sky, and burst over Fort Sumter, the signal. Within seconds, the rest of the Confederate batteries opened up, their muzzles flaring like a chain of bonfires around the water. Inside the fort, Major Anderson's men scrambled to their posts. The bombardment was relentless, coming from all directions: Sullivan's Island, Morris Island, James Island. Brick and stone shook with each impact, dust filling the air inside the barracks. The men loaded and fired back where they could, but their position was awkward. Sumter's guns were mounted high, meant for defense against ships, not low-lying shore batteries. Hitting the Confederate positions was like trying to swat hornets with a broom handle. What's remarkable in hindsight is that this furious exchange of fire, the one that launched the bloodiest conflict in American history, caused no deaths during the battle itself. That was partly luck and partly design. Anderson's men avoided standing in exposed positions, and the Confederates seemed more focused on forcing a surrender than on wiping out the garrison. Still, the noise was enough to rattle the bones of anyone within earshot. People poured into Charleston's streets and rooftops to watch the spectacle. Women brought opera glasses. Children climbed onto barrels for a better view. Merchants stood shoulder to shoulder with sailors and laborers, all staring toward the fort as if it were the main act of some grim theater. One observer wrote that the scene was at once terrible and magnificent, the city's own fireworks, except every blast carried the weight of history. The bombardment didn't stop when the sun rose. Smoke clung to the water. By afternoon, Sumter's flag was still flying, tattered but defiant. Confederate gunners kept up the pressure, determined to end it before the resupply ships could even think about intervening. By the second day, the fort's barracks were on fire. The men inside fought the flames as much as they fought the enemy's artillery, hauling water by hand, coughing through the smoke. Anderson finally agreed to surrender on April 13th, after holding out for roughly 34 hours. His men marched out with their honor intact, the Union flag carefully folded and carried with them. The Confederates allowed them to salute the flag before departure, a moment of strange, fleeting civility in what would become an increasingly merciless war. The irony? The only fatality connected to Fort Sumter came after the surrender, when a cannon misfired during the ceremonial salute, killing a Union soldier. It was a cruel omen, in a way, for what was to come. This war would take lives in moments both grand and absurd. Back in Washington, Lincoln received the news with the clarity of a man who knew the die was cast. Fort Sumter wasn't just lost, the country was now at war. When the smoke cleared over Charleston Harbor, Abraham Lincoln didn't waste a second. On April 15th, just 2 days after the surrender of Fort Sumter, he issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion and to cause the laws to be duly executed. Those words sounded firm and resolute, but they also lit a powder keg far beyond what anyone had expected. In Washington and the northern states, the response was electric. Town squares filled with crowds eager to enlist. Men lined up to sign up, some barely old enough to grow a beard, others gray-haired veterans from earlier conflicts. Local bands struck up rousing tunes. Speeches inspired by a sense of duty and patriotism stirred hearts, and newspapers printed the names of the first volunteers like honors rolls. The excitement was contagious, a kind of rush that made many believe the war would be over before winter's first snow. But down south, the effect was exactly the opposite. Lincoln's called galvanized, wavering states, especially in the Upper South. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, all still officially in the Union, saw the federal government's move as an invasion. They quickly followed South Carolina's lead and declared their own secession. The map of the United States was redrawing itself with dizzying speed. This domino effect wasn't just political, it hit deep into communities and families. Imagine a Virginia town where neighbors suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the fence, literally and figuratively. Some would join the Confederate cause, others stayed loyal to the Union. The lines that separated friend from foe grew thinner and more painful. At the same time, enthusiasm ran high in both camps. In the North, the war was often described as a noble crusade to save the Union and end the rebellion. In the South, it was a fight for liberty, states' rights, and a way of life. Both sides wrapped their cause in language of honor and righteousness. You've probably heard the phrase, "It would be over by Christmas," countless times in stories about the Civil War. That's not just Hollywood nostalgia, it was a genuine belief. Young men signed up with dreams of glory and quick victory. Camps were filled with laughter, songs, and stories of heroic battles they'd barely imagined but fully expected. Just a few months, they said, then we'll all be home. In reality, that hope was tragically naive. The war that began with a few hours of cannon fire at Fort Sumter would stretch on for 4 brutal years, rewriting American history with every bloody mile. But at that moment, with flags waving and spirits soaring, no one wanted to think about the long, hard road ahead. The nation was on fire, and everyone believed they could control the blaze. You know, there's something almost heartbreaking about that phrase. Over by Christmas. It captures the mood of 1861 better than any textbook line ever could. As the war's first smoke curled over Charleston Harbor, most folks on both sides were convinced this terrible business would be done in a flash. Why? Well, part of it was simple optimism, or maybe more like wishful thinking. After all, these were Americans, many of them with shared history, culture, even family ties stretching across the invisible line of division. War was unthinkable, yet somehow they imagined it could be quick, clean, and maybe even honorable. The romanticized vision of soldiering, drawn from stories of past conflicts, was still very much alive. Brave men marching off to battle, a few clashes, a decisive victory, and then home in time for the holidays. There's also a fair dose of underestimating the other side. Northerners often saw the Confederacy as a collection of states that couldn't possibly hold together against the might of the Union. Southerners, on the other hand, believed their superior military traditions and knowledge of the land would quickly turn the tide. Both sides thought their cause was just, and their opponents would crumble before long. Add to that the fact that the Industrial Revolution was still settling in, and large-scale, prolonged warfare with mass casualties and modern weapons was something few fully grasped. The grim realities of trench warfare, attrition, and shattered families were distant shadows, not immediate concerns. But here's the twist. That naive belief shaped the early conduct of the war in ways that would haunt both North and South. Generals planned campaigns with quick strikes, politicians pushed for short enlistments, and the general public expected celebrations before New Year's. That overconfidence sometimes translated into poor preparation, inadequate logistics, and a brutal learning curve on the battlefield. Meanwhile, underneath the surface, the seeds of long, grinding conflict were already planted. The divisions in society, the economic differences, the deep questions about freedom and sovereignty. None of these vanished with the first cannon blasts. If anything, they intensified. So while flags flew high and young men marched off with bright eyes and pounding hearts, the war they were stepping into was about to teach them a harsh lesson. Fort Sumter wasn't just the starting gun. It was the point of no return. And as history shows, sometimes the most dangerous battles are the ones we don't see coming. The slow, grinding wars of attrition, where hope and reality clash in ways no one expects. War, as it turns out, is never quite what you imagine. Both the North and South entered 1861 with grand ideas, rosy expectations, and a dash of swagger. It'll be over quick, many thought. Maybe a few sharp skirmishes, a bit of grandstanding, and then back to business. But history loves to laugh at plans. The first major clash at Bull Run wasn't just a battle. It was a rude, chaotic slap in the face that shattered illusions and revealed a war far bloodier and more complicated than anyone had guessed. So, what really happened when the smoke cleared from that summer day's chaos? And how did that first bloody dance shape everything that came after? Let's walk through the battles, the blunders, and the bold moments that transformed a hopeful skirmish into the grinding nightmare the Civil War became. July 21st, 1861. Washington, D.C. wasn't just a political hub. It was buzzing like a summer fairground, and the scene was set for what many hoped would be a victorious show battle. Imagine this. Families packed picnics, people in their Sunday best, children on shoulders, all eager to watch the Union Army crush the rebels in a grand demonstration of Northern might. It sounds almost surreal, right? Civilians had such a naive idea of what war would be like. They treated it like a sporting event. The Union troops, mostly volunteers fresh off farms and small towns, had little training and less battle experience. Their blue uniforms were stiff and unfamiliar, muskets heavy and clumsy. On the other side, the Confederates were just as green, many donning patchwork gear, driven more by passion than polish. It was an army of amateurs facing off with another army of amateurs, both believing in a quick end. At first, things went relatively well for the Union. They pushed the Southern forces back along the railroad junction near Manassas. But the battlefield was confusing, riddled with thick woods, hills, and smoke. Orders got lost or misinterpreted. The troops often didn't know where to go or who to listen to. And then came the turning point. The arrival of Confederate reinforcements under General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Jackson's brigade stood firm, like a stone wall, as one officer exclaimed, refusing to give ground. This stubborn defense stopped the Union advance dead in its tracks. Soon after, Confederate forces counterattacked with unexpected vigor. What followed was pandemonium. Union soldiers broke ranks and ran, and the civilians who came to watch suddenly found themselves fleeing for their lives. The Union defeat was humiliating and terrifying. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just a military setback. It was a psychological gut punch. The war was no longer a distant possibility. It was real, bloody, and grueling. Let's talk about the man behind that unforgettable nickname. Thomas Jonathan Jackson was a figure who, at first glance, wouldn't scream war hero. Before the war, he was a reserved, deeply religious man and a professor at the Virginia Military Institute. No booming speeches or larger-than-life personality. But on the battlefield, he was a rock. At Bull Run, Jackson's brigade held their ground with an unyielding stubbornness that shocked even his fellow officers. His calm under pressure and unshakable will to hold the line inspired not only his men, but the entire Confederate Army. The phrase Stonewall Jackson wasn't just a catchy nickname. It symbolized resilience and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. What's interesting is how quickly legends form in war. The myth of Stonewall Jackson was born in those chaotic moments, a symbol of Southern grit and tactical brilliance. His leadership style, strict discipline mixed with personal bravery, made him a revered figure, and his legend only grew as the war dragged on. While the spotlight was on the East Coast, the border states were spinning their own chaotic stories. Missouri, a border state with deep internal divisions, became a battleground for guerrilla warfare, neighbor against neighbor violence, and fierce battles that felt more like feuds than formal fights. August 10th, 1861, saw the Battle of Wilson's Creek near Springfield, Missouri. Union forces faced off against a Confederate force bolstered by local militias and irregular fighters. The fighting was brutal and disorganized. Troops on both sides were often confused about who was friend or foe. The woods echoed with gunfire, screams, and the frantic commands of officers trying desperately to impose order. This wasn't a neat battlefield. It was raw, messy, and personal. Guerrilla fighters, who operated with little regard for formal rules, added to the chaos, making Missouri a tinderbox of violence that didn't just affect armies, but local civilians caught in the crossfire. The Confederates won the battle, but didn't secure Missouri. Instead, the state remained a bloody tug-of-war zone for years, reflecting the fractured nature of the war itself, dividing not just North and South, but families and communities. While land battles grabbed the headlines, a quieter, slower war was beginning at sea. President Lincoln and his generals knew the South depended heavily on its ports to bring in weapons and supplies from Europe, especially cotton trade with Britain and France. The Anaconda Plan was born out of this strategic understanding. Named for the snake that slowly squeezes its prey, the idea was to blockade southern ports and strangle their economy over time. No flashy charges or dramatic assaults here, just a slow, tightening grip designed to choke the South into submission. But blockading thousands of miles of coastline wasn't a walk in the park. The Union Navy was small and inexperienced, scrambling to cover key ports like Charleston, New Orleans, and Savannah. The Confederates, meanwhile, used fast, nimble blockade runners to sneak supplies past the Union ships. It was a cat-and-mouse game with high stakes. Though imperfect and slow to start, the blockade symbolized a new kind of warfare, one that combined sea power and economic strategy. It was a long game, and both sides knew it. Beyond the battles and blockades, both armies faced another enemy: chaos. The reality of war logistics, a nightmare of shortages, bad planning, and raw recruits, soon became painfully clear. Uniforms were often ill-fitting or in short supply. Soldiers sometimes marched barefoot or with patched shoes. Food was inconsistent, and diseases spread rapidly in crowded camps. The South struggled with fewer resources and less industrial infrastructure, but the North faced similar problems on a larger scale. Leadership was another big hurdle. Many commanders were political appointees or had risen quickly without solid military backgrounds. Orders got lost or misunderstood, units went missing or fought in the wrong places, and soldiers, many of whom had never fired a gun, were thrown into confusion and fear. The early months of the war were marked by blunders and missteps. But these mistakes were part of a brutal learning curve that would shape the armies into more effective forces, even if the cost was painfully high. By the time the dust settled from these first clashes, one thing was clear. Neither side was ready for the full horror of the Civil War. The battlefields had tested not only tactics, but the very spirit and endurance of soldiers and civilians alike. Bull Run was not just a Southern victory. It was a sobering lesson for the entire nation. The myth of a quick, glorious war was shattered. Stonewall Jackson's legend was born in fire, but so was the brutal reality that war demands more than courage. It demands preparation, resources, and sometimes painful sacrifice. Missouri's chaos showed how the war was fracturing more than states. It was ripping communities apart. And the Anaconda Plan revealed a strategic patience that contrasted with the immediate violence on land. Through it all, one question lingered: who really won those early battles? The answer, of course, is complicated. The Confederacy took the field that day, but the Union learned hard lessons that would shape their eventual victory. In the end, the first clashes of the Civil War were less about triumph and more about survival, shaping a conflict that would stretch on for 4 bloody years, an unforgettable mix of chaos, courage, and harsh reality. When you think of the Civil War, your mind might jump to famous battles in Virginia or Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, Antietam, or Bull Run. But here's the thing: The fate of the entire conflict often hinged on a less glamorous battleground: rivers, specifically the Mississippi River. It was the grand, twisting backbone of America's interior, running like a giant, sluggish snake from the northern lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico. Controlling it wasn't just about bragging rights. It was about controlling the very arteries that fed the nation. Imagine the Mississippi as the Interstate 95 of the 1860s, but way more important. Roads were poor, railroads scarce, and often unreliable, but the river? It was the main highway for men, weapons, food, and hope. Whoever owned that river could choke off enemy supplies and divide the Confederacy right down the middle. Sounds simple, right? But the battle for river supremacy was a brutal, nail-biting tug-of-war that would shape the war's entire course. This less spotlighted theater in the West and on the rivers would see some of the most decisive and daring moments of the war. And at the center of it all, a rising Union star, Ulysses S. Grant. You've probably heard his name in passing, but at this point in 1862, he was about to prove he was no ordinary commander. Early 1862. The war was still young, but everyone sensed the tides shifting. Ulysses S. Grant, a colonel many had dismissed as a failure before the war, was making bold moves that would earn him a reputation and change everything. His first target was Fort Henry, perched precariously on the Tennessee River. Now, here's the kicker. Fort Henry was practically drowning. Seasonal floods had turned the fort's grounds into a soggy mess. You could almost say the river was swallowing a whole. The Confederates thought the fort's position was a defensive advantage, but Grant saw it differently. Alongside naval gunboats, he hammered Fort Henry relentlessly. The fort's shaky defenses couldn't hold, and in February 1862, it surrendered swiftly. This victory might sound small, but it was a shot across the bow, a signal that the Union was serious about controlling the waterways. And more importantly, it gave Grant momentum and confidence. Not stopping there, Grant set his sights on Fort Donelson, upstream on the Cumberland River. This was a much tougher nut to crack, better defended, bigger garrison, and a key to Confederate supply lines. The siege was tense and the fighting fierce. Confederate commanders attempted a breakout, but Grant's forces blocked every escape route. When the Confederates finally offered to surrender, Grant famously insisted on unconditional and immediate surrender. No negotiations, no favors. This phrase didn't just win the battle. It earned Grant the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. It shocked both Union supporters and Confederate foes alike. Here was a general demanding total victory. No compromises, no second chances. Grant's approach was straightforward, aggressive, relentless, and unafraid to keep pushing. These wins opened the door to deeper advances into Confederate territory, turning the Mississippi and its tributaries into a new front line. If Fort Donelson was a wake-up call, the Battle of Shiloh was a gut punch. In April 1862, Grant's troops camped near the Tennessee River felt safe. Too safe, it turns out. Confederate forces, under Generals Albert, Sidney Johnston, and P.G.T. Beauregard, launched a surprise attack at dawn. The Union Army was caught flat-footed. What followed was 2 days of relentless carnage. Forests and fields turned into killing grounds, with men fighting and dying in numbers that stunned the nation. Nearly 24,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing by the time the smoke cleared. Think about that for a second. Casualty numbers like that in just 2 days. It was horrifying. News from Shiloh shattered the hope many had clung to, that the war might be over quickly, or at least without unbearable suffering. This was total war, the real deal, and it was going to be ugly. Grant faced enormous pressure to pull back and regroup. Some even called for his removal. But he stood firm, refusing to give ground. Reinforcements arrived just in time, allowing the Union to counterattack and push the Confederates away. Shiloh was a turning point, not just in military terms, but psychologically. It taught Americans, North and South alike, that this war would demand unimaginable sacrifice and endurance. And for Grant, it was both a trial by fire and a testament to his stubborn resilience. His leadership during and after the battle cemented his reputation as a commander willing to absorb pain and keep fighting. While Grant was making headlines on the rivers, the Union Navy was about to pull off a bold stroke down south. Admiral David Farragut led a daring campaign to seize New Orleans, the South's largest city and a vital port. If the Union could capture it, they would not only disrupt Confederate supply lines, but deal a psychological blow that echoed far beyond the Gulf Coast. The challenge? New Orleans was protected by two heavily armed forts, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, guarding the mouth of the Mississippi. Farragut's plan was nothing short of audacious. Take his fleet and run right past these forts under heavy fire in the dead of night. Imagine that. Massive wooden ships filled with gunpowder and men, navigating narrow, enemy-controlled waterways, dodging shells and underwater mines. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Against all odds, Farragut's fleet succeeded. By April 1862, New Orleans was under Union control without the city being ravaged by land assault. The capture was a game-changer. Not only did it give the Union a huge port and supply base, but sent a clear message. The Confederacy's grip was slipping. Control of the Mississippi was no longer just a hope. It was a real, unfolding reality. With New Orleans fallen and Forts Henry and Donelson behind them, you might think the Union had the Mississippi locked down. But there was one glaring exception: Vicksburg. Perched high on cliffs overlooking a horseshoe bend in the river, Vicksburg was a natural fortress. Its guns commanded the waterway, making it a formidable obstacle. The city was a lifeline for the Confederacy, keeping their western states connected to the east. Losing Vicksburg would split the South in two and choke off supplies, reinforcements, and communication. That's why Vicksburg held firm for months, refusing to fall despite Union attempts. It was a tough nut to crack, defended by a determined Confederate force and aided by the city's rugged terrain. The Union realized that capturing Vicksburg wouldn't be a quick grab. It required a long, grueling siege. This campaign would become one of the Civil War's defining moments. So, while much of the Mississippi was under Union control, this one stubborn city was the final barrier. The river was their lifeblood, and Vicksburg was its heart. So why does all this matter? What do these battles along the rivers and in the West reveal about the broader conflict? First off, they show the evolution of the war itself. From early skirmishes to a brutal contest where control of geography and resources mattered as much as battlefield valor. Grant's aggressive style, demonstrated in his river campaigns, marked a shift in Union leadership, a move towards unrelenting pressure on Confederate forces. His willingness to accept risk and refuse compromise laid the groundwork for later victories. Shiloh's staggering losses shattered illusions about the war's nature and foreshadowed the massive human cost to come. Meanwhile, naval power, often overshadowed by land battles, showed its critical role. Farragut's capture of New Orleans wasn't just a naval success. It was a strategic masterstroke that shifted the balance of power. And Vicksburg's stubborn defense reminds us that war isn't just about winning battles. It's about perseverance, terrain, and willpower. Together, these river campaigns fractured the Confederacy, sapped their resources, and gave the Union momentum. The Mississippi became less a highway for Southern hope and more a symbol of Union dominance. But the struggle was far from over. The war ahead would be long and bloody. Still, these early victories set the tone, showed what was possible, and, frankly, showed that the Union was here to stay. You ever wonder how much geography shapes history? Well, the rivers of the Civil War remind us. Sometimes the landscape is the real battlefield. When most people think of the Civil War, images of dusty battlefields like Gettysburg or Antietam probably come to mind. But here's the thing. Some of the most crucial moments of the war happened far away from those famous fields, along muddy rivers and in dense western forests. The Mississippi River was the lifeblood of 19th century America. Stretching over 2,300 miles from Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico, it was the country's great water highway, its backbone. Whoever controlled this artery controlled the flow of supplies, troops, and hope itself. You can think of the Mississippi like a huge, winding interstate. In a time before highways and fast railroads, the river was the fastest, cheapest way to move men and materials. Control the river, and you essentially control the heart of the nation. For the Union, taking the Mississippi was a key step towards slicing the Confederacy in half, cutting off Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the rest. This Western theater and the battle for the rivers might not be as famous as the fighting in the East, but their importance can't be overstated. In many ways, the future of the war was decided right here. And standing at the forefront of these battles was a man few had taken seriously just months earlier, Ulysses S. Grant. It was early 1862, and the war was still in its infancy, but already the stakes were climbing. Grant, a former failed businessman and barely noticed officer, was about to make a splash that would forever change his life in the course of the war. His first target? Fort Henry, a Confederate stronghold on the Tennessee River. Now, Fort Henry wasn't exactly a fortress built on rock. It was practically drowning in the river's seasonal floods. Imagine trying to hold a fort in a swampy, soggy mess. The Confederates thought it was defensible, but Grant saw an opportunity. With the help of Union gunboats pounding the fort's weak defenses, Fort Henry fell quickly in February 1862. The Confederates were caught off guard, and the victory was swift. This might seem like a small step, but it was huge. The river was now open to Union forces, a door cracked wide for further incursions. Next up was Fort Donelson, just a bit further upriver on the Cumberland. This fort was bigger, better defended, and crucial for Confederate supply lines. Grant's forces surrounded Fort Donelson, cutting off escape routes and laying siege. The fighting was fierce, but after days of combat, the Confederates sent out a delegate to negotiate terms. And here's where Grant's boldness shone. He famously demanded unconditional and immediate surrender. No bargaining, no partial deals. This uncompromising stance stunned everyone and earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through both North and South. Here was a Union general who refused to settle for anything less than total victory, and it made the Confederates realize the war was far from over. If Fort Donelson put Grant on the map, the Battle of Shiloh shook the nation to its core. In April 1862, near a small Tennessee church named Shiloh, Confederate forces launched a surprise dawn attack on Grant's encamped troops. The Union soldiers were caught flat-footed. What followed was 2 days of unrelenting slaughter, one of the bloodiest battles up to that point in American history. Nearly 24,000 casualties combined, dead, wounded, and missing. The scale of suffering was unimaginable to the public back home. Newspapers and citizens alike were stunned. This wasn't going to be a quick or clean fight. Shiloh was a brutal preview of the terrible cost this war would demand. Grant's army was pushed to the brink. There were even calls to remove him from command after the initial chaos. But Grant held fast. Reinforcements arrived in time, and the Union launched a powerful counterattack that forced the Confederates to retreat. The victory was costly, but it proved a vital point. Grant wasn't a quitter. The war was only just beginning, and it would require stubborn resilience from both sides. Shiloh shattered illusions that the war might be over quickly or without massive bloodshed. The war was evolving, and it was about to get much, much worse. While Grant made waves in Tennessee, another force was moving downriver, the Union Navy, led by Admiral David Farragut. New Orleans was the South's largest city and a critical port. Losing it would be a crushing blow to Confederate supply chains and morale. But the city wasn't undefended. Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip guarded the river's mouth with heavy guns and underwater mines, then called torpedoes. Taking New Orleans meant running the gauntlet. Farragut's plan? To take his fleet under cover of darkness and steam past these forts, right under their noses, dodging shells and torpedoes as they went. It sounds like something out of a thriller, and honestly it was. Against the odds, Farragut's fleet slipped through. In April 1862, New Orleans fell to Union forces with barely a fight on land. This was a massive psychological and strategic victory. The largest Confederate city was now in Union hands. The Mississippi River was more than halfway under Northern control. Farragut showed how naval power wasn't just support. It could lead the charge and reshape the war's landscape. With Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and New Orleans captured, you might think the Union had the Mississippi in the bag. Not so fast. The city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, sitting high on cliffs overlooking a sharp bend in the river, was a stubborn blockade. It was a natural fortress, its guns commanding the waterway for miles. The Confederates knew that holding Vicksburg was critical. It kept their western states connected to the east and allowed vital supplies to flow. Taking Vicksburg was like trying to knock down a brick wall. The terrain was tough, and Confederate defenders were determined. The Union knew it wouldn't be an easy capture. It would require a long siege, patience, and grit. So while the Union controlled much of the Mississippi, Vicksburg stood firm as the last major obstacle to total river control. This stalemate foreshadowed a brutal campaign that would test the limits of both armies and change the war's course yet again. What do these battles along the rivers and in the West reveal about the bigger picture? First, they show how the war was evolving from a series of limited engagements into a full-scale conflict where controlling geography and logistics was just as vital as winning battles. Grant's aggressive, unyielding leadership style symbolized a new kind of war, one where you pushed hard, demanded total victory, and refused to back down. Shiloh was a grim lesson that the war's cost would be devastating, forcing Americans on both sides to face harsh realities. Farragut's naval exploits proved that waterways weren't just sidelines. They were front lines shaping the outcome. And Vicksburg's defense reminded everyone that terrain and resolve could prolong the fight, making victory all the sweeter when it finally came. Together, these campaigns broke the Confederacy's hold on the Mississippi, choked off supplies, and gave the Union a strategic upper hand. But they also hinted at the long, brutal road ahead. The rivers were battlegrounds where the future of the nation flowed, and where the war's deadliest chapters were still to be written. If you think being a Civil War general was just about waving a sword and barking orders, think again. Behind every battle was a tangle of egos, politics, and personal doubts that shaped every decision, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Take McClellan, for example. On paper, he was brilliant, a superb organizer who turned ragtag recruits into a formidable army. But the guy had a serious case of better safe than sorry syndrome. His cautiousness wasn't just battlefield prudence. It was also wrapped up in a deep mistrust of his political overseers, especially Lincoln. Lincoln, for his part, was juggling more than just generals. He had to keep Congress happy, the Northern public hopeful, and the Army effective, all while facing a stubborn enemy that refused to fold. Meanwhile, after Pope's defeat, Washington was scrambling. Was McClellan still the man for the job, or was he too cautious? Should they bring in someone new? The problem was, no one really stood out as the clear answer. You know what it's like when your team's star player is benched and the substitutes just don't have the spark? That's pretty much what the Union Army leadership felt like at this moment. A whole lot of uncertainty with no obvious solutions. War isn't just about maps and maneuvers. It's about people, soldiers and civilians alike, and their will to keep fighting. On the Confederate side, victories like the 7 Days battles and Second Bull Run felt like lifelines. For a population stretched thin and facing an industrial giant, these wins were proof their cause was worth it. The South's morale skyrocketed. You could almost hear the celebration echoing through southern towns, the churches packed with thankful prayers, the soldiers feeling like they could finally take the fight north. In the North, however, things were more complicated. The steady drip of setbacks, especially the humiliations at Second Bull Run, left many questioning the war effort. Soldiers in the field grumbled about poor leadership. Families back home worried about what this all meant for their sons and husbands. Lincoln had to walk a tightrope, calming a public increasingly restless for results while pushing his generals to act decisively. Here's something that often gets lost in the thick of battlefield tales. Politics was always running alongside the fighting, shaping decisions and tempering strategies. Northern politicians were under pressure to show progress or risk losing support altogether. Radical Republicans wanted tougher action, while more cautious voices urged patience. Lincoln, ever the politician, had to balance these factions while also keeping his military leaders from falling apart under scrutiny. Confederate politics had its own headaches, but victories helped quiet internal dissent and gave Jefferson Davis and his government breathing room. This political tug-of-war added another layer of complexity to an already tangled conflict. It wasn't just about who could shoot straighter or move faster. It was about who could maintain faith in the cause, both in camp and in the halls of power. By the end of summer 1862, the Eastern Theater was locked in something close to a stalemate. Neither side had gained a clear advantage, but both had suffered wounds, physical, psychological, and political, that would shape the battles to come. Lee's daring had shifted the momentum to the South, but the Union was far from defeated. They were regrouping, reconsidering, and getting ready for what promised to be an even fiercer struggle. If there's one takeaway here, it's this: war is messy. It's rarely about quick victories or clean lines. It's a grinding, exhausting contest where leadership, morale, politics, and plain stubbornness collide. And sometimes the only thing you can count on is that the next battle will surprise you. If you had stepped back to 1862 and asked folks where this bloody Civil War was headed, you probably would have been met with a shrug, a hopeful smile, or a bitter scowl, depending on who you talked to. The fighting had already taken a brutal toll, and no one really knew how or when it might end. But then came a gamble so daring it sent shockwaves through battle lines, dinner tables, and even distant capitals in Europe. Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy's star general, decided to cross into Union territory, kicking off what we now call the Maryland Campaign. You'd think of battles just about troops lining up and shooting, but Antietam was much more than that. It was a clash where military strategy collided with high-stakes politics, where the very meaning of the war was about to shift. So let's step back and walk through this bloody day and its ripples to understand why Antietam still echoes through American history. Picture this. It's late summer 1862, and the Confederate Army, led by General Robert E. Lee, is riding high on a string of victories in Virginia. The South's morale is up, but the war isn't won. Far from it. Supplies are running thin, and the pressure is mounting. Lee faces a tough question: how to break the stalemate. His answer? Take the fight to the north. But this wasn't just a military decision. It was a political gambit. Lee's plan was audacious: invade Maryland, a border state with divided loyalties, and maybe even sway it to join the Confederacy. Maryland sat in a precarious position, legally part of the Union, but many residents harbored Southern sympathies. Imagine neighborhoods where families were split, friends found themselves on opposite sides, and the very ground beneath was tangled in conflicting hopes. Lee also knew the economic pull of Maryland's fertile farms and towns. Confederate troops were often hungry, and Lee's army badly needed food, horses, and supplies that they couldn't get at home. The farms and warehouses of Maryland offered a tempting cash to keep the soldiers fed and ready. There was a bigger picture, too. Lee hoped a victory on Union soil might shake Northern confidence, rally Southern supporters, and crucially, attract recognition and aid from powerful European nations like Britain and France. Those countries depended heavily on Southern cotton for their textile industries, and if they recognized the Confederacy, the war could take a whole new turn. This move was a gamble, a high-wire act with no safety net. Crossing into enemy territory meant the Confederate Army risked being cut off from home, supply lines stretched thin, and facing a better-resourced enemy. But Lee was confident and bold. On the flip side, Marylanders faced their own kind of pressure. Some quietly hoped for peace, others whispered support for the South, and still others stood firm with the Union. The presence of Confederate troops marching through towns left no one untouched. The uncertainty was palpable. Neighbors watching neighbors, loyalties tested at kitchen tables and church pews alike. You have to admire the audacity of Lee's move. It was a statement. The Confederacy wasn't just defending itself anymore. It was pushing forward, daring the North to respond on its own turf. Now, let's talk about the day that history still remembers. September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest single day in American history. If you can imagine a place where fear, courage, confusion, and brutality swirled like a violent storm, that was Antietam. The battle wasn't a neat, orderly affair. It wasn't rows of soldiers marching in lockstep. Instead, it was fragmented fighting, bursts of ferocious combat, erupting in different places across a few miles. The cornfield, Bloody Lane, and Burnside's Bridge each became a hellish backdrop for scenes of heroism and horror. The cornfield saw wave after wave of soldiers charging, retreating, and charging again, men caught in a deadly dance of musket fire, smoke, and screams. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. One soldier later recalled the ground was so churned up by feet and cannon fire that it resembled a plowed field stained red. Then there was Bloody Lane, a sunken road that became a grim funnel of death. Confederate troops held the high ground, raining fire down on Union soldiers trapped below. The carnage was staggering. Wounded men lay in heaps, cries filling the air as doctors and chaplains rushed to help, often at great risk themselves. And Burnside's Bridge, a small, unassuming stone bridge, became a symbol of the day's grinding struggle. Union troops repeatedly tried to cross it, but faced fierce resistance from Confederate sharpshooters positioned on the heights beyond. Hours passed with little ground gained, lives lost in the tens and hundreds. That bridge, just 12 feet wide, bottlenecked the battle, slowing the Union advance at a critical moment. By day's end, the human cost was staggering. Over 22,000 casualties, including more than 3,600 dead. It's hard to even wrap your mind around those numbers. For perspective, that's more Americans killed or wounded in one day than in many other conflicts combined. But despite the bloodshed, the battle was essentially a tactical draw. Lee's forces held their ground, but were badly battered and low on supplies. McClellan, commanding the Union Army, was cautious to a fault. He could have pressed harder, but hesitated, worried about overextending. That hesitation frustrated Lincoln and many others. Victory was a strange word here. Who really won when so many died and neither side could claim clear supremacy? The answer lies less on the battlefield and more in the political arena. Here's where things get really interesting. Up until now, the Civil War was officially about keeping the Union intact, not about slavery. But President Abraham Lincoln had quietly been wrestling with a deeper question: how to end slavery in the rebellious states. He had already drafted a document, the Emancipation Proclamation, but he waited for the right moment to issue it. And that moment came after Antietam. The battle gave Lincoln what he needed: a Union victory to justify changing the war's aim without it seeming like a desperate move. On September 22nd, 1862, just days after the battle, Lincoln announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that starting January 1st, 1863, all slaves in the Confederate States still in rebellion shall be thenceforward, and forever free. This was a game changer. Suddenly, the war wasn't just about preserving the Union. It was about ending slavery. This shift gave the North a powerful moral cause and made the Confederacy's fight look not just like rebellion, but a defense of slavery. The proclamation had its limits. It didn't free slaves in loyal border states like Maryland or Kentucky. It was a strategic move as much as a moral one. But symbolically, it flipped the script. You can almost hear the mixed reactions. Abolitionists cheered. Finally, a step toward justice. Some Northerners bristled, worried about how this would affect the fragile coalition holding the Union together. Southerners seethed. Slavery was at the heart of their society, and this was a direct threat. Lincoln's timing was brilliant politics. He used the battle's outcome to bolster his position, knowing that issuing the proclamation after a union one would give it more weight. It sent a clear message. This war is now about freedom as well as union. If you think the Civil War was just an American story, think again. The eyes of the world, especially those of Britain and France, were glued to the conflict. Before Antietam, Britain and France were seriously considering recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. The South's cotton exports were vital to their textile industries, and many elites admired the Southern cause. Official recognition could tip the scales in favor of the South, providing them with money, weapons, and prestige. But then came the Emancipation Proclamation. It complicated matters. Now, the war was clearly a fight against slavery. Public opinion in Europe shifted. Abolitionists pushed their governments to stay out of the war or at least not support a slaveholding confederacy. It became politically tricky for leaders to back the South without alienating their citizens. At the same time, economic interests pulled the other way. Cotton was still king after all. So Britain and France played a careful game, delaying recognition and intervention, watching closely to see which way the wind would blow. Antietam, followed by the proclamation, bought the Union valuable time, to regroup and strengthen, while European powers hesitated. In the end, no foreign nation recognized the Confederacy, a diplomatic victory that helped tilt the war's outcome. Antietam didn't end the war, far from it, but it changed its course. The battle revealed the staggering human cost of the conflict. Families shattered, communities grieving, a nation bleeding. It exposed the limits of leadership on both sides. McClellan's caution frustrated many. Lee's daring came with heavy losses, and Lincoln's leadership entered a new, bolder phase. More than that, Antietam reshaped how Americans saw the war itself. No longer could it be seen simply as a quarrel over states, rights, or territory. Now, it was about human freedom and the soul of the nation. Soldiers returned from that day forever marked. Letters home spoke of horror and bravery, of the terrible cornfield and bloody lane. Chaplains carried the wounded and whispered prayers under fire. Families waited, hoping for news, fearing the worst. Antietam was a brutal teacher, one that reminded the nation that progress often demands sacrifice. So why does Antietam still matter? Because it's a story about more than a battlefield. It's about leadership in crisis, about timing and narrative, about how one day can shift the entire course of history. It reminds us that war isn't just fought with rifles and cannons. It's fought with ideas, with speeches, with a willingness to redefine what a country stands for. Antietam shows how a bloody, confusing, costly battle can become a powerful symbol, a pivot point where violence and vision collide, where a nation decides who it wants to be. So next time you hear Antietam, don't just think of the blood and the loss. Think about the hope that emerged from the smoke, the courage that shaped a new purpose, and the moment when America began to truly reckon with freedom. Leadership changes in wartime are always loaded moments, charged with hope, skepticism, and, let's be honest, a little anxiety. In the fall of 1862, after the cautious and often criticized leadership of George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside took command of the Union's Army of the Potomac. This was no easy gig, taking the helm of a massive army that had just suffered through bruising defeats and stalled campaigns. The stakes? Absolutely huge. The nation was still reeling from the bloodshed of Antietam and the long grind of a war that refused to end quickly. Burnside was a man of contradictions. On one hand, he had battlefield experience and a reputation for daring. On the other, he had a tendency to rush headlong into situations without always weighing all the consequences. You can imagine the mix of optimism and dread that swept through the ranks when he took over. Soldiers hoped for a leader who would finally crack the Confederate grip, but some officers worried about Burnside's decisiveness, or lack thereof. And there's always the human element. Burnside's trademark facial hair, those famous sideburns, made him a bit of a celebrity in his own right. But could his personality and style translate into effective command? That question hung over the Union Army like a thick fog. As the cold months settled in, all eyes were on Burnside to see what kind of leader he really was. Burnside's plan was straightforward. Move the army to Fredericksburg, Virginia, cross the Rappahannock River, and march toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. On paper, it was a solid choice. Fredericksburg sat on a direct route to Richmond and offered a strategic foothold. The problem? It didn't quite work out that way in practice. Here's the kicker. The army needed pontoon bridges to cross the river. These were large, floating bridges essential to ferry troops, horses, and heavy artillery. But thanks to a mix of logistical snafus and poor communication, the pontoons were delayed for weeks. Weeks that Lee and his generals used to build one of the strongest defensive lines seen in the war, Mary's Heights. If you picture Mary's Heights, imagine a steep, rocky ridge lined with Confederate artillery and sharpshooters perched like hawks, waiting to pick off any attackers below. The terrain itself was a nightmare for Burnside's men, who had no choice but to charge uphill in repeated assaults. When the Union finally launched its attacks, it was nothing short of tragic. Waves of soldiers moved forward across open fields, exposed to devastating fire. It was like watching brave men walking into a storm of bullets and cannonballs, unable to break through. Casualties piled up in the thousands, with little ground gained. The aftermath? A bitter defeat. Union morale plummeted. Burnside faced harsh criticism, both from within the Army and from political leaders in Washington. The press wasn't kind either. Headlines screamed about the slaughter at Fredericksburg, painting Burnside as reckless and incompetent. But it wasn't just poor planning or bad luck. The defeat at Fredericksburg highlighted deeper issues: the challenges of coordinating massive troop movements, the brutal reality of Civil War combat, and the stubbornness of commanders on both sides refusing to give ground. You might think a loss is just something armies expect now and then. But the impact of Fredericksburg went far beyond military statistics. The psychological toll was enormous. Letters home from Union soldiers described exhaustion, frustration, and disillusionment. Some wrote about the horror of watching comrades fall in front of their eyes. Others questioned if the sacrifices were worth it. Imagine being a soldier trying to hold on to hope while buried in mud and surrounded by death. Back home, families followed the news with a mix of dread and disbelief. The once steadfast support for the war was starting to waver. The wounds of Fredericksburg cut through the national consciousness. Even the leaders struggled. Burnside tried to keep spirits up, but the cracks were obvious. Rumors of his potential replacement spread like wildfire. Lincoln, famously patient but pragmatic, faced mounting pressure from politicians who wanted more aggressive action, or, in some quarters, peace talks. It's easy to overlook how morale, often seen as soft or intangible, is really the lifeblood of any army. When soldiers start doubting their leaders, their cause, or even their survival chances, it ripples outward, impacting everything from discipline to public support. If Fredericksburg was a crushing blow, the Mud March was a grinding, humiliating stumble. Determined to redeem himself, Burnside planned a bold winter offensive in January 1863. The goal was to cross the Rappahannock at a new point, flank Lee's army, and gain an upper hand before spring. Sounds good on paper, right? But here's the thing. Winter in Virginia can be brutally unforgiving, and this particular winter was no exception. After heavy rains, the roads turned into rivers of mud. Deep, sticky mud that sucked at horses' hooves, wagons, and soldiers alike. Imagine thousands of men slogging through this quagmire, struggling to move artillery pieces stuck in the muck, soldiers slipping and falling. The whole operation slowed to a crawl. The very ground seemed to conspire against Burnside's plans. As days dragged on, frustration turned to despair. Troops grew demoralized, questioning the point of the march. Burnside himself admitted defeat, and the whole thing was called off within days. The Mud March was more than a failed military maneuver. It became a symbol of the Union Army's troubles. Leaders questioned Burnside's judgment, and soon he was replaced by Joseph Hooker. So what happened next? Enter Joseph Hooker, a leader with a reputation for boldness and swagger. He took command in early 1863, promising to revitalize the Union Army and strike a decisive blow. Hooker's army marched toward Chancellorsville, hoping to outmaneuver Lee's forces. But Lee, ever the master strategist, did something audacious. He split his smaller army in the face of a larger enemy, usually a no-no in military textbooks. The result? One of the most stunning tactical maneuvers in American history. Stonewall Jackson led a daring flank attack, catching the Union forces completely off guard. The battlefield exploded into chaos, with Union troops thrown into disarray. The Confederates gained the upper hand against overwhelming odds. But the victory came at a terrible cost. During a reconnaissance mission, Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men and later died from complications. His death was a huge blow to the Confederate cause, a tragic loss of one of its greatest leaders. Chancellorsville was a bittersweet moment. The Confederacy scored a major victory, boosting morale and solidifying Lee's legend. Yet the loss of Jackson tempered that success, reminding everyone of war's brutal toll. While battles raged in Virginia, politics back home were heating up, and not in a good way. The string of setbacks, mounting casualties, and seemingly endless conflicts stirred unrest in northern states. Peace advocates, known as Copperheads, gained traction, calling for an end to the war and negotiations with the South. Radical Republicans, meanwhile, demanded more aggressive war policies and the abolition of slavery. Lincoln found himself squeezed between these extremes. His political capital was stretched thin as public patience wore down. Newspapers, speeches, and even popular songs reflected the growing weariness and frustration. The question many asked was simple but powerful. How much longer can this drag on? It was a refrain that echoed in parlors, taverns, and even among soldiers in the camps. This political unrest complicated military efforts, as Lincoln had to balance pushing the war forward while keeping a fractious nation united. What do we learn from this turbulent chapter of the Civil War? The story of Burnside, Fredericksburg, the Mud March, and Chancellorsville shows us the messy reality of leadership under pressure. Burnside's missteps remind us how difficult it is to command massive armies amid shifting terrain, supply problems, and human frailty. Hooker's boldness and Lee's brilliance highlight how genius and risk-taking can reshape battles, yet also come with unforeseen costs. Lee's reputation soared, and Confederate morale was buoyed, but the war's human toll deepened. Soldiers on both sides suffered unimaginable losses, and civilians lived with uncertainty and fear. Northern political unrest underscored the fragile nature of public support in wartime, a reminder that wars are fought not just on battlefields, but in hearts and minds. And through it all, the nation edged toward more pivotal moments: Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and the full reckoning of slavery and freedom. This era of command shifts, disaster, and triumph captures the raw, unpredictable, and deeply human side of the Civil War. It wasn't just about strategy or politics, it was about people, their courage, their mistakes, their hopes, and the heavy price they paid. History often feels like a chain of events, each link forged from countless moments of courage, mistakes, luck, and sheer human will. Yet some moments shine brighter, like lightning bolts that suddenly illuminate everything around them. July of 1863 was one of those moments in the American Civil War. Two monumental battles, Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, unfolded nearly simultaneously, shifting the war's momentum irreversibly. Lee's bold gamble at Gettysburg and Grant's relentless siege at Vicksburg together marked the high watermark for the Confederacy. But before we dive into the roar of muskets and thunder of cannons, let's set the stage. Why did Lee choose to invade the North again? What were the hopes, fears, and realities driving both sides into these brutal confrontations? Let me walk you through the story, because it's not just about tactics or troop movements. It's about people, decisions, and the raw human spirit stretched to its limits. You might be asking, after the carnage of Antietam in 1862, the deadliest single day in American history, why would General Robert Lee dare to launch another invasion into Union territory? It sounds almost reckless, right? But history rarely moves in straight lines, and Lee's decision was shaped by a tangled web of military necessity, political hope, and sheer desperation. The Confederacy was struggling. Southern farms and towns had been hit hard by the ongoing war, and supplies were running dangerously low. The Union blockade choked off access to foreign goods and disrupted internal trade routes. Lee saw invading the North as a way to relieve pressure on war-torn Virginia. By living off northern farms, disrupting Union logistics and forcing the Union Army to chase him away from Confederate soil. There was also a larger, more political goal. A Confederate victory on Union soil might bolster Southern morale, which was flagging after months of grinding conflict and heavy losses. It might also convince foreign powers like Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation or even intervene on its behalf. After all, European textile mills depended heavily on Southern cotton, and there was talk in London and Paris about stepping in to keep the cotton flowing. Lee was confident. His army was battle-hardened and proud after victories like Chancellorsville, and he believed a bold strike north might break the Union's will to fight. So in June 1863, Lee crossed the Potomac River with roughly 75,000 men, beginning what would be known as his second invasion of the North. Imagine you're living in a quiet Pennsylvania town in June 1863. You've heard about battles in Virginia and Maryland, but the war has never come this close. Suddenly, reports start trickling in. Confederate soldiers are spotted marching through the countryside. Local farmers see camps forming on their lands, horses grazing in their fields. The war that felt like a distant thunderstorm is now a storm raging at your doorstep. Northern newspapers ran headlines warning citizens to prepare, and politicians debated what this invasion meant for the Union war effort. For the common people, fear mixed with curiosity. Would the Confederates loot their homes? Would there be fighting in their streets? For the soldiers, the coming days would test their courage and endurance like never before. Gettysburg wasn't planned to be a battleground. In fact, it was a bit of a wrong place, wrong time scenario. Confederate cavalry under General G.B. Stuart was scouting ahead, while Union forces under General John Buford were tasked with delaying the Southern advance. The two sides bumped into each other near the town, and what started as a small skirmish quickly escalated. Reinforcements poured in, and the fields, farms, and hillsides around Gettysburg became a swirling maelstrom of smoke, musket fire, and confusion. The first day ended with Confederate troops pushing Union forces through the town, but the Union Army was not defeated. Instead, they retreated to a series of defensive positions south and west of Gettysburg, including Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, which offered commanding views and natural protection. The Union troops dug in, setting the stage for a tense standoff. The men knew this was no ordinary battle. This was a fight that could decide the fate of the nation. If July 1st was chaotic, July 2nd was hell on earth. The Union Army held strong on the high ground, which meant the Confederates had to launch attacks uphill through difficult terrain. The fighting exploded around several key locations with evocative names that echo through history: Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, and the Peach Orchard. Little Round Top was a rugged, rocky hill on the Union's left flank. If the Confederates had taken it, they could have rolled up the Union line from the side, a potentially devastating blow. Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment famously held the hill in a desperate bayonet charge that has since become legendary. Across the battlefield, waves of Confederate soldiers attacked repeatedly. The fighting was brutal, often hand-to-hand. Smoke clogged the air. The sounds of rifles cracking and cannons booming echoed constantly, and the ground was littered with the fallen. Yet the Union held, inch by bloody inch. It was a day of courage, endurance, and terrible loss. Now, here's the moment everyone remembers, and for good reason. On the third day, Lee decided to gamble everything on a massive frontal assault on the center of the Union line at Cemetery Ridge. He believed that if his troops could break through, the Union Army would collapse, and victory would be theirs. Pickett's charge, named after Confederate General George Pickett, involved approximately 12,500 men advancing across nearly a mile of open farmland under heavy artillery and rifle fire. It was, by all accounts, a suicide mission. The Confederate soldiers marched shoulder to shoulder, braving exploding shells and deadly rifle volleys. Many never made it halfway. By the time they reached the Union lines, the survivors were shattered, disorganized, and overwhelmed. Union defenders repulsed the attack with devastating effectiveness. Pickett's division suffered nearly 50% casualties. Lee's hope for a decisive victory was dashed. The aftermath was grim. The fields that day were littered with thousands of dead and wounded. The Confederacy's greatest offensive thrust into Northern territory had failed spectacularly. You might wonder, was it just bad luck? Or poor tactics? The truth is, Gettysburg's Confederate defeat came from a tangled mix of factors. Lee's army was stretched thin and running low on supplies after months of campaigning. Communication errors led to some Confederate attacks not being properly coordinated. Some commanders hesitated or misunderstood orders. On the other side, the Union had chosen strong defensive ground and fought with tenacity. They also benefited from interior lines, meaning they could move reinforcements more quickly and superior numbers. But beyond the technical side, human factors loomed large. The Southern troops were exhausted. The Union soldiers, though battered, fought with the fierce determination of men defending their homes and families. War is messy, unpredictable, and brutal, and Gettysburg captured all of that in stark relief. While the smoke and horror of Gettysburg were unfolding in Pennsylvania, something equally momentous was happening on the banks of the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was a jewel in the Confederacy's crown, perched high above the river on bluffs, controlling river traffic and keeping the southwestern states linked. If the Union could capture Vicksburg, they'd effectively split the Confederacy in two. Enter General Ulysses S. Grant, a relentless and pragmatic commander who had learned from earlier mistakes. Rather than rush an assault on the well-fortified city, he opted to surround it. For nearly 7 weeks, from May through early July, Grant's forces laid siege. Union artillery pounded the city constantly. Confederate soldiers and civilians endured severe shortages of food and supplies. Starvation, disease, and despair set in. Inside Vicksburg, families huddled in caves and cellars to avoid the bombardment. Soldiers stood watch, their faces etched with fatigue and determination. The pressure was immense on both sides. As the last echoes of Gettysburg's battle faded, Grant's siege finally succeeded. On July 4th, America's Independence Day, the Confederate commander at Vicksburg, General John Pemberton, surrendered the city to Grant. The timing wasn't lost on anyone. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, slicing the Confederacy in half and choking off vital supplies and communication. The fall of Vicksburg was a strategic knockout blow. It opened the door for the Union to move deeper into the South and tighten the noose around Confederate hopes. You might think Gettysburg alone was the war's turning point, but it was actually the combination of Gettysburg and Vicksburg that changed everything. Together, these battles crushed the Confederacy's hopes of winning independence through bold invasions or controlling strategic waterways. From this point on, the South was forced onto the defensive. Northern morale soared. Newspapers celebrated victories on two fronts. International observers, who'd been weighing whether to recognize the Confederacy, began to doubt Southern chances. President Abraham Lincoln famously described the war as a test of whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. July 1863 answered that question in favor of the Union. After these twin blows, the Confederacy's strategic options narrowed drastically. They no longer had the freedom to roam northern states or control vital rivers. Instead, they clung to territory they could defend. The Union, on the other hand, grew more confident and aggressive. Leaders like Grant began coordinated campaigns that pressed the Confederacy relentlessly. The war shifted from sporadic clashes to a grinding struggle of attrition. This new phase tested not just armies but civilians on both sides, as resources dwindled and desperation grew. Amid the grand sweep of history, it's easy to lose sight of the individuals caught in the maelstrom. At Gettysburg, a young Union lieutenant wrote home about the terror of Pickett's charge. The earth was covered with the dead and wounded. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the dying. In Vicksburg, a mother described how her family took shelter in a cave during the bombardment, holding hands and praying. These personal stories remind us that history isn't just about generals and strategies. It's about people. People who fought, suffered, and hoped for peace. Visit Gettysburg now and you'll find rolling fields dotted with monuments, quiet cemeteries, and the preserved battlegrounds that tell the story. It's a place where history feels alive, where the sacrifices made so long ago still resonate. Vicksburg, too, is remembered as a symbol of endurance and strategic brilliance. The Mississippi River flows past, carrying the echoes of a time when a nation was torn apart but ultimately pulled back from the brink. So, was Lee's second invasion just another campaign? Was Vicksburg just a siege? Hardly. Together, they form a dramatic chapter in the story of America's struggle, a time when bold gambles met harsh realities and hope clashed with desperation. They show us how history is shaped not by inevitabilities, but by choices made under fire. They remind us of the cost of division, the price of unity, and the resilience of a nation forged in conflict. July of 1863 wasn't just a moment. It was the turning point that carried America toward a new future. When you think of the Civil War's defining moments, your mind probably jumps to Gettysburg or Antietam. Those massive, brutal battles in the East get all the headlines, and rightfully so. But if you ask historians or Civil War buffs, there's another theater just as crucial, where the war's momentum shifted in ways few expected. That's the Western theater, particularly the stretch from Chattanooga to Sherman's March to the Sea. It's a story of blood, guts, and grit, and a testament to how leadership and strategy can turn despair into decisive victory. Here's the thing about Chattanooga. It wasn't just a random city sitting quietly on the Tennessee River. No, this place was the strategic key to the Deep South. Think of it as a massive railroad hub, a gateway that linked the Confederacy's heartland to its coastal defenses and supply lines. Whoever controlled Chattanooga had a huge advantage in moving troops and supplies. By the fall of 1863, the Union Army had pushed into Chattanooga after a tough campaign. But the victory at Chickamauga, just weeks earlier, had thrown a wrench in their plans. The Union forces found themselves cornered, trapped in the city, surrounded by Confederate troops who were eager to finish them off. The siege that followed was tense and brutal, like being stuck in a pressure cooker with the lid about to blow. Imagine being one of those Union soldiers, hungry, cold, isolated, and wondering if help was coming. Supplies were scarce, morale was shaky, and the southern hills and ridges looming over the city were held by enemy forces who watched and waited. The Confederates had won a tactical victory at Chickamauga, but they were stretched thin, short on resources and reinforcements. Both sides were locked in a deadly stalemate, but the Union's position was perilous. Let's rewind for a moment to the Battle of Chickamauga itself, because it sets the scene for what comes next. Chickamauga was one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War, fought in thick woods that swallowed men whole. The chaos was unimaginable. Units got lost, commands broke down, and soldiers fought blindly in the smoke and the trees. The Confederates, led by General Braxton Bragg, snagged a hard-fought victory and pushed the Union Army back toward Chattanooga. But this one wasn't a knockout punch. It was more like a heavy blow that left both sides battered. The Union Army retreated into Chattanooga, only to find themselves besieged, trapped inside the city with dwindling supplies. The siege could have broken the Union forces and maybe the war itself. But then came Ulysses S. Grant, fresh from his victories at Vicksburg and convinced that he could crack the code of this Western war. Grant's arrival brought renewed hope. He wasn't a flashy leader, but he was relentless. Grant immediately set about opening supply lines, most famously the Cracker Line, a risky route to bring in food and ammo. Then he planned a series of attacks that would change everything. The battles for Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge followed, and they're legendary for a reason. At Lookout Mountain, troops fought literally above the clouds, charging up steep slopes shrouded in fog and smoke. The Union's victory there broke Confederate control of the high ground. Meanwhile, Missionary Ridge saw a spontaneous but desperate Union assault that shattered the Confederate line. The Southern forces, caught off guard, had to retreat in disarray. The siege was broken, the Union Army was saved, and the door to the Deep South was flung wide open. Here's a moment that often gets overlooked. After Chattanooga, Lincoln didn't just want Grant to keep fighting in the West. He wanted him to run the whole show. Promoted to lieutenant general, Grant was the first to hold that rank since George Washington. That's not just a title. It's a sign that the presidency was putting its trust in one man to bring all Union armies under a unified command. Grant's leadership style was a mix of stubborn determination and practical grit. He wasn't one for grand orations or theatrics. Instead, he believed in moving forward, wearing down the enemy, and applying pressure relentlessly. This new command wasn't just a change in rank. It marked a shift in Union strategy. The war was no longer about holding or gaining territory slowly. It was about hitting hard, coordinated offensives and accepting that victory would come at a high cost. Grant was willing to gamble with lives if it meant ending the war sooner. Not everyone was on board at first. Some generals bristled under Grant's no-nonsense style. Soldiers had to adjust to the new intensity, and families back home worried about the rising casualty lists. But Grant's vision was clear: no more playing defense. It was time to bring the war home to the South and end it decisively. Atlanta was the jewel in the Confederacy's industrial crown. It was more than just a city. It was a lifeline for Southern armies, a hub of railroads, factories, and supply lines. Taking Atlanta meant cutting off much of the Confederacy's ability to fight. Sherman, who'd fought alongside Grant, was the man chosen to lead the campaign. His approach was methodical and unyielding. The fighting wasn't just on open fields, but in the city's outskirts, twisting through forests, farms, and small towns. The siege itself was a drawn-out affair. Union troops encircled the city, tightening the noose day by day. Atlanta's fall in September 1864 was a crushing blow to the Confederacy. You might be wondering, why did this matter beyond the battlefield? Well, Lincoln's re-election that year was far from guaranteed. The war was dragging on, and the public's patience was wearing thin. When news of Atlanta's capture spread, it gave Lincoln's campaign the boost it desperately needed. But victory came with a price. For the people of Atlanta, the city's fall was heartbreaking. There was anger, sorrow, and a fierce resolve to keep fighting despite the devastation. Sherman's reputation as a tough, sometimes ruthless general grew, and the stage was set for his next bold move. You've probably heard of Sherman's March to the Sea. It's one of those Civil War moments that almost feels legendary, like something out of a gritty novel or a movie. But here's the thing. It was real, it was brutal, and it changed the very nature of warfare. After taking Atlanta, Sherman didn't just stop and rest on his laurels. Nope. Instead, he planned a massive, destructive campaign through Georgia, aiming straight for Savannah on the Atlantic coast. His goal? To break the Confederacy's backbone, not just by defeating armies, but by destroying its ability to feed, supply, and house those armies. The march was about 285 miles long, through some of the South's richest farmland. Sherman's troops moved in loose columns, living off the land as they went. But living off the land was a polite way of saying they tore up railroads, burned crops, dismantled factories, and in many cases took or destroyed anything that might help the Confederate war effort. For civilians caught in the path, it was terrifying. Towns were left in ruins, homes burned or ransacked. Families watched helplessly as their world turned to ash. Some hated Sherman with a burning passion. Others were just worn down, exhausted by the endless war. There's a famous quote attributed to Sherman, who supposedly said, "War is hell." Well, this march embodied that sentiment. It wasn't just about fighting soldiers. It was psychological warfare, a statement that the Confederacy could no longer protect its own people or land. But was Sherman too harsh? That question has haunted historians for decades. Some argue his tactics were necessary to end a war that was dragging on and costing thousands more lives. Others see the march as a harsh, almost vindictive, scorched earth campaign. Whatever your view, one thing is clear. Sherman's march broke the will of the South in a way no single battle had. It sent a powerful message that the Confederacy was vulnerable from the inside out. When you step back and look at all these events, Chattanooga, Grant's rise, Sherman's Atlanta campaign, and the March to the Sea, they aren't just isolated battles or military maneuvers. Together, they marked a turning point in the Civil War. For the Confederacy, these losses were devastating. They shattered not only armies, but also infrastructure and morale. The South's ability to wage war was severely crippled, and hope of victory slipped further away with every mile Sherman's men marched. On the Union side, these victories lifted spirits and steadied political nerves. Lincoln's re-election campaign, for example, was buoyed by the fall of Atlanta, giving the president the mandate to see the war through. More than that, these campaigns signaled a shift in how the war was fought. The era of cautious, limited battles was giving way to total war, where civilian resources and morale became as important as military targets. It was a harsh, painful evolution, but one that ultimately helped bring about the end of the conflict. The Confederacy was being squeezed from all sides, and leaders like Grant and Sherman weren't afraid to apply relentless pressure. So, from those desperate days trapped in Chattanooga to the smoldering fields of Georgia, this stretch of the Civil War reshaped everything. It showed the power of bold leadership, the cost of war, and the complex ways that battles extend far beyond soldiers on the field. By late 1864, the war had changed dramatically. The Confederacy was battered, the Union was pushing forward, and the idea of unconditional surrender wasn't just a dream. It was becoming a reality. What followed was a brutal final year, a reckoning for a nation torn apart but slowly knitting itself back together. The story of Chattanooga to the Sea is a reminder of how war is about much more than strategy or territory. It's about people, hope, fear, and the hard choices that define history. And honestly, it's a story worth remembering. Relentless battles, brutal choices, and the war that changed everything by the spring of 1864. The American Civil War had dragged on for 3 long, unforgiving years. The early romanticism of battle, the flags waving, the stirring speeches, the hope for a quick victory, had long since faded. What was left? Mud, blood, and a deep, gnawing exhaustion that crept into the bones of every soldier on both sides. Into this weary, war-weary world stepped Ulysses S. Grant, not as the cautious, hesitant commander some remembered from earlier campaigns, but as a man with a new vision, one that demanded not brilliance in maneuvers or flashy victories, but sheer, unyielding pressure. His goal was to grind down Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, to chase it, corner it, and wear it out until the Confederacy simply could not fight anymore. And so began the Overland Campaign, an epic 6-week slugfest of battles that tore through the thick Virginia wilderness, the sprawling fields around Spotsylvania, and finally the blood-soaked lines near Cold Harbor. This was not just a campaign of battles, but of wills, not just of guns, but grit. It was raw, brutal, and relentless. If you ever wonder what it must feel like to fight in a place that doesn't just challenge your enemy, but also your very senses, look no further than the wilderness. Picture this: a dense forest thick with towering oaks, pines, and thick underbrush so tangled that cavalry horses stumbled, artillery got stuck, and commanders struggled to even see their own troops. This wasn't a battlefield you could easily command or control. It was like stepping into a maze shrouded in smoke and chaos. Grant's army, around 100,000 strong, was advancing, determined to pin down Lee's smaller force and force a battle. But the wilderness had a mind of its own. The forest swallowed sound and sight alike. Gunfire echoed strangely. Soldiers lost orientation. Worse, dry underbrush caught fire during the fighting, turning the tangled woods into a hellish oven where men burned alive alongside gunfire and musket smoke. The fighting here was unlike anything seen before in the Civil War. This wasn't the open field volley of musketry or the thunderous cannon barges that could be seen miles away. This was chaotic, desperate combat. Men stabbing with bayonets, firing at close quarters, sometimes even fighting hand-to-hand. The dense trees made traditional formations impossible. Soldiers fought almost blindly, trusting only in their comrades beside them. Despite the chaos, the fighting was ferocious on both sides. The Confederates were dug in, defending their homeland fiercely, while the Union troops pushed forward with grim determination. By the end of the battle, Neither side had won decisively. But the cost was staggering. About 17,000 Union casualties and 11,000 Confederate casualties. It was a rude awakening for both armies. This war would be long, brutal, and unforgiving. You know what's striking about the Wilderness? It shattered any illusions that the war could be swift or glorious. The forest was a physical and symbolic representation of the tangled, brutal conflict that lay ahead. Just days after the Wilderness, both armies limped to Spotsylvania Courthouse, less than 10 miles away. Here, the nature of the fighting shifted from chaotic skirmishes to something far darker: trench warfare. If you think trench warfare belongs to the muddy fields of World War I, think again. Spotsylvania was one of the first American battles to showcase entrenched lines, earthworks, and brutal, grinding combat where men clawed at every inch of ground. The most infamous location? The Mule Shoe Salient, a protruding bulge in Lee's defenses that became the focal point of some of the fiercest fighting in the campaign. Imagine soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, locked in almost nightmarish close quarters. For nearly 20 hours, Union and Confederate troops attacked and counterattacked in a deadly dance of blood and mud. The ground was churned into a sloppy battlefield, with bodies piled high, faces smeared with sweat, dirt, and blood. Soldiers fought with bayonets and fists, grappling so closely that many accounts describe it as a brutal brawl rather than a battle. The psychological toll? Immense. Men were exhausted, terrified, and close to breaking. Letters from soldiers talk about how the bloody angle felt like a nightmare they couldn't escape, an endless, grinding slaughter. Lee's defensive brilliance shone here. He anticipated Grant's attacks, positioning his smaller force to make the most of the terrain and fortifications. But Grant's unyielding pressure never wavered. This was a war not of spectacular victories, but of persistence, wearing down the enemy inch by bloody inch. It's easy to forget how close this campaign came to breaking the soldiers' spirits. The brutality was relentless, the conditions horrific, and yet they kept fighting. By early June, the Union Army was battered but still marching, and Lee's defenses tightened near Cold Harbor. Here came one of the most tragic and controversial episodes of the campaign. Grant, confident and perhaps too eager, ordered a massive frontal assault against Lee's fortified positions. What followed was sheer carnage. Thousands of Union soldiers were cut down in mere minutes by Confederate rifles and artillery. It was an attack so costly and so futile that it has gone down in history as one of the bloodiest mistakes of the war. You might wonder, why would Grant order such a deadly assault? Historians debate it still. Some argue he underestimated the strength of Lee's defenses. Others say he was desperate to break the stalemate. What's clear, though, is the human cost was staggering. Veterans remember Cold Harbor as a place where hope died alongside thousands of men. The screams and cries of the wounded haunted the survivors. Yet even this horror didn't stop Grant. His vision was clear. The war was now about outlasting the enemy. The battle lines were drawn not just in earth and blood, but in sheer determination. Grant's words echoed through the Army campfires and command tents alike. I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. It wasn't just bravado. It was a deliberate declaration of strategy. Earlier Union generals had often pulled back after heavy losses, looking for tactical advantages or trying to avoid disaster. Grant, though, understood the harsh truth of the conflict. Only the Union had the resources and manpower to sustain a long, grinding war. His plan? To keep Lee's forces constantly engaged, constantly pressured, to bleed the Confederate Army dry until it could no longer fight. It was a brutal strategy, with no illusions about the cost. Thousands would die in months of combat. But Grant's focus was unshakable. On the Confederate side, Lee faced a nightmare. Each battle shrank his army's ranks. Men were tired, supplies were scarce, and the weight of leadership pressed harder every day. Still, Lee's tactical genius allowed him to hold off the numerically superior Union forces again and again. But the strain was visible. Letters home from Confederate soldiers grew more desperate. "We are the last hope of a sinking cause," one wrote. The weight of exhaustion was almost tangible. When we talk about campaigns and strategies, it's easy to get lost in numbers and maps. But behind every bullet and bayonet was a human story. Men who marched for miles on blistered feet, who fought through rain and sun, who stared death in the face and kept moving forward. The Overland Campaign was not just a military operation. It was a crucible of human endurance. Soldiers on both sides endured mud, hunger, wounds, and the constant noise of battle. Morale fluctuated wildly, from grim resolve to crushing despair. One Confederate private described the experience as a slow death, where hope is the only thing harder to kill than the enemy. On the Union side, soldiers rallied around Grant's steady leadership. They saw in him a man who would not quit, a leader willing to share their hardships. That quiet determination inspired many to press on despite the carnage. If the Overland Campaign was a brutal chess game, Lee and Grant were the grandmasters locked in an intense duel. Lee's brilliance lay in his defensive tactics, his ability to read the battlefield, and his uncanny knack for stretching his smaller force to its limits. He fought with the ferocity of a man defending his home, using every advantage the terrain and circumstance provided. Grant's strength was in his unwavering resolve and strategic vision. He understood that victory wouldn't come in a single, glorious battle, but in a long war of attrition that would sap the Confederacy's strength. Both men bore heavy burdens. Both faced criticism, from politicians, from their soldiers, from history itself. Yet their clash would come to define not only the Overland Campaign, but the very nature of modern war. When people think of the Civil War, they often think of Gettysburg or Antietam. But the Overland Campaign deserved a place in that pantheon of historic battles. Why? Because it marked a turning point. It showed the harsh new face of war. Not glorious, but grinding and relentless. It foreshadowed the modern wars of the 20th century, with entrenched lines, massive casualties, and the primacy of endurance over tactics. Grant's willingness to accept high losses was controversial, but it ultimately broke Lee's army and paved the way to Richmond's fall. Lee's defense, though doomed, remains a testament to tactical skill and courage under unimaginable pressure. In the end, the Overland Campaign was not just a battle for land or victory. It was a battle for the very soul of the nation, fought in mud, sweat, and blood. And it set the stage for the final chapter of America's great internal conflict. After the Union's costly failure at Cold Harbor in June 1864, Ulysses S. Grant faced a stubborn truth. This war wasn't going to be won with flashy charges or quick battles. Instead, he needed a plan that would slowly squeeze the life out of the Confederacy, and that meant targeting Petersburg. Now, Petersburg might sound like just another dusty southern town, but for the Confederate war effort, it was far more than that. Think of it as a critical traffic hub where several key railroads converged like the spokes of a wheel, funneling supplies directly into Richmond, the Confederate capital. If you cut off those spokes, Richmond's whole supply chain would collapse. Grant saw Petersburg as the perfect target for a new strategy. Rather than hammering against the iron walls of Richmond's defenses head-on, he would attack its lifelines. The aim was to starve the city, choke off Lee's army, and force a surrender without the massive bloodshed of frontal assaults. This shift marked the start of something rare in American military history at the time, a siege. Siege warfare was more common in European conflicts, but here in the Virginia wilderness, it would become a brutal, drawn-out affair lasting 9 long months. What makes the Petersburg siege so fascinating and tragic is that it foreshadowed the trench warfare that would dominate World War I nearly 50 years later. Soldiers dug themselves into the earth, building elaborate networks of trenches, rifle pits, and fortifications, locking into a deadly stalemate. Can you imagine the sheer monotony mixed with terror? Day after day, month after month, men sat cramped in muddy trenches, waiting for a signal that might send them charging into a hail of bullets or exploding shells. The constant sound of artillery was a grim soundtrack, while the air hung heavy with smoke, sweat, and the ever-present stench of death. It's easy to forget, but this wasn't just a military campaign. It was a human ordeal. Soldiers and civilians alike faced unimaginable hardship. For the men on the front lines, every day was a battle to stay alive, not just from the enemy, but from disease, exposure, and exhaustion. For civilians in Petersburg and Richmond, life became a tense balancing act between hope and despair. You know what's wild? These trenches were the first real taste America got of modern warfare's grinding, impersonal nature. The romantic notions of glorious battle gave way to a grueling fight of attrition, a test of endurance, willpower, and resourcefulness. Grant's move toward Petersburg wasn't just a change in geography. It was a shift in strategy and mindset. And it set the stage for some of the most harrowing months of the Civil War. When Grant's army rolled into Petersburg in mid-June 1864, the real work began, not with a bang, but a grind. Instead of sweeping maneuvers or lightning strikes, both sides dug in, literally. Soldiers picked up shovels and started crafting miles of trenches, earthworks, and defensive positions. The landscape quickly transformed from open fields and forests into a labyrinth of mud, wood, and steel. Grant's men laid siege to Petersburg, cutting off railroad lines and tightening the noose. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces were stretched thin, desperately trying to hold their lines with fewer men and less supplies than ever before. Life in these trenches was brutal and bizarre in equal measure. Picture this: thick Virginia mud soaking through boots and uniforms, rain turning the ground into a quagmire, and soldiers trying to keep dry and sane in cramped, rat-infested dugouts. The smell, oh, the smell, was something soldiers often mentioned in letters and diaries. It was a mix of sweat, gunpowder, spoiled food, and worse. The unwashed bodies of men confined in tight quarters didn't help. But maybe the worst part was the endless waiting. Hours stretched into days as men stared across no man's land, listening for signs of an enemy attack or a chance to raid the other side. The silence was almost as terrifying as the gunfire. When fighting did break out, it was often sudden and savage, an explosion of bullets, bayonets, and artillery shells. Then the quiet would return, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the cries of medics. At the same time, the soldiers coped in creative ways. They swapped letters with loved ones, sang songs softly around campfires, shared stories, and sometimes even joked to lift the heavy mood. Humor and camaraderie became lifelines, fragile threads holding the fraying nerves of men battered by the siege. The civilians of Petersburg and nearby Richmond endured their own nightmare. Food shortages grew worse by the week as supply lines were cut. Markets emptied, prices soared, and the simple act of finding a meal became a daily struggle. Families huddled in dark cellars to avoid the shells and gunfire. Children played cautiously, their laughter often cut short by the whistle of an incoming shell. Amid all this, you can almost feel the city's heartbeat slow, hope battling fear in every street and home. And so, what started as a military encirclement became a war of endurance and willpower. Neither side wanted to give ground, but the siege took its toll on both armies and the civilians caught in the middle. Interestingly, the Petersburg campaign forced both generals and soldiers to rethink traditional warfare. Gone were the massive, open field charges that had characterized battles earlier in the war. Instead, it was trench lines, mining, skirmishes, and attrition, a deadly chess game where every inch of earth mattered. That brings us to one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes of the siege, the Battle of the Crater. If you think siege warfare sounds dull, the Union's plan to blow a massive hole under the Confederate lines was about as bold and bizarre as it gets. A group of Union soldiers, many of them former coal miners from Pennsylvania, took on the dangerous task of digging a tunnel beneath the enemy's position. They worked quietly and meticulously, inching forward through dark earth, hoping to surprise the Confederates. When the tunnel was complete, they packed it with 8,000 pounds of explosives, enough to create a crater hundreds of feet wide and dozens deep. The goal was simple: blow the Confederate line apart, then send troops rushing through the gap. On July 30th, 1864, the mine detonated with a thunderous blast that shook the earth and sent debris soaring. The explosion carved out a massive crater, instantly killing hundreds of Confederate soldiers and throwing their line into chaos. For a moment, it seemed like the Union had achieved a stunning breakthrough. But here's the kicker. Instead of running around the crater to seize strategic ground, many Union troops plunged into the crater itself. The pit's steep, muddy walls trapped them like rats in a hole. Confederate troops recovered quickly and began firing down into the crater, turning it into a deadly trap. Add to that a last-minute change in leadership for the assault troops, many of whom were untrained for this specific attack, and the whole operation descended into confusion and disaster. Troops were trapped, disorganized, and under withering fire. The chance to break Petersburg's defenses slipped through the Union's fingers. The crater ended up being a horrific Union defeat, with heavy casualties and morale taking a hard hit. Confederate defenders, on the other hand, found renewed confidence amid the chaos. In hindsight, the Battle of the Crater is a tragic example of how bold plans can go horribly wrong without clear leadership and preparation. The missed opportunity haunted Grant and his commanders for the rest of the siege. Despite the crater fiasco, Grant kept his eyes on the prize, and the prize was Petersburg supply lines. Grant's strategy evolved into relentless pressure on the railroads and roads feeding Petersburg and Richmond. Targets like the Weldon Railroad and Boynton Plank Road became battlegrounds themselves. Each Union push to cut these vital arteries was met with fierce resistance. The Confederates understood that their city's fate and the Army's survival depended on holding them. As the months dragged on, the Union's slow strangulation tactic began to take hold. Confederate supply trains became scarcer, ammunition ran low, and food shortages worsened. Starvation was no longer just a rumor or fear. It was a daily reality. Civilians in Richmond and Petersburg faced the cruelest consequences. Bread lines grew longer, markets emptied, and desperation turned people to scavenging for anything edible, from roots and leaves to rats. Stories surfaced of families boiling leather shoes and hunting rats just to survive. Prices skyrocketed, and the shadow of hunger hung over every household. Confederate soldiers felt it too. Fighting on empty stomachs, with threadbare uniforms and dwindling hope, they held the line because they had to, not because it got any easier. This shift from direct combat to economic and psychological warfare highlighted the complexity of the siege. Grant's campaign was no longer just about controlling land. It was about breaking the spirit of a nation. And boy, did that spirit start to crack. By late 1864 and early 1865, the once mighty Confederate Army was fraying at the edges. Desertion rates climbed as worn-down soldiers fled the front lines. Sometimes they returned home to care for their starving families. Other times they just disappeared into the forests or sympathetic communities. This wasn't just a breakdown in discipline. It was human nature fighting back against unbearable conditions. At home, Southern communities wrestled with rising dissent and hardship. Arguments over food, resources, and war policies split families and towns. Protests erupted. Near riots broke out as hunger and fear reached a boiling point. Even the proud defenders of the South, men who had marched bravely in a battle, found their resolve tested to its limit. Lee's once proud army was becoming a shadow of itself, weighed down by hunger, cold, and despair. Letters from the trenches tell a haunting story. Men reduced to ghosts, waiting for a dawn that seemed forever out of reach. This unraveling wasn't just about lost battles. It was about the slow erosion of hope. The siege of Petersburg wasn't just a military campaign. It was a brutal, grinding war of attrition that felt like it would never end. For nearly 10 months, from June 1864 to April 1865, Union and Confederate soldiers clawed at the earth, digging trenches, building fortifications, and trading deadly blows in a battle of wills. The landscape around Petersburg, Virginia, looked like a scarred battlefield straight out of a nightmare. trenches winding through fields, battered railroads, and exhausted men who looked like they hadn't seen a proper night's sleep in forever. By early April 1865, things were coming to a head. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who had settled into a war of persistence and strategy, was ready to make a move that would shatter the Confederate line. The Southern Army under Robert E. Lee was stretched thin, almost threadbare, facing shortages of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Lee's men were tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. There was a deep, creeping despair beneath their stiffened faces. Grant's plan was simple but daring. Concentrate overwhelming force on a weak point in the Confederate defenses and break through. And that's exactly what happened on April 2nd, 1865. Union troops launched a massive assault, battering the trenches, overpowering outposts, and tearing holes in a line that Lee's forces could no longer plug. The crack was loud and devastating, like the snapping of a brittle branch in a forest long frozen. You know that feeling when everything's about to change, but you don't realize it until it's too late? That's exactly what April 14th felt like. The war was over, or so people thought. The Union had won at Appomattox just days earlier, and the nation was beginning to exhale. Lincoln decided to attend a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. A simple evening, one might say. But lurking in the shadows was John Wilkes Booth, a passionate, dangerous actor with a fiery hatred for Lincoln and everything he represented. Booth wasn't just any assassin. He was a man on a mission, desperate and reckless. The moment he fired that single shot into the president's head, the world tilted on its axis. The sound echoed not just through the theater, but across the country's heart. Lincoln slumped, wounded, his life bleeding away as chaos erupted around him. Booth made a daring escape, slipping through the streets of Washington with a hunted man's urgency. What followed was a nationwide manhunt that gripped the public's attention and kept the nation on edge. The assassination wasn't just a violent act. It was a shattering symbol. The man who had envisioned healing was suddenly gone, and the fragile hope Lincoln's words had sparked seemed to flicker dangerously close to extinction. The days that followed Lincoln's death felt like a waking nightmare. The country plunged into mourning on a scale it had never seen. From bustling cities to tiny towns, people wept openly. Flags flew at half-mast. Newspapers printed portraits and poems. Speeches mourned the fallen leader. And somehow, amid this sorrow, Lincoln became a martyr, the living embodiment of unity and peace. But grief wasn't simple. It was tangled up with fear, anger, and confusion. What would happen now? Who would lead the shattered nation? Could the fragile bonds of peace survive without Lincoln's steady hand? The answer wasn't clear. In Washington, the political scene was suddenly volatile. The power vacuum left behind meant competing factions jostled for control. Some feared chaos, others saw opportunity. And everywhere, ordinary Americans wrestled with their emotions. Hope for the future tempered by the raw wound of loss. Lincoln's death wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of an era. Into this storm stepped Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, a man often overlooked but suddenly thrust into the nation's spotlight. Johnson was an odd choice in many ways. A Southern Democrat loyal to the Union, he came from humble beginnings in Tennessee. He had a rougher, more blunt style than Lincoln's thoughtful grace. Right away, it was clear that Johnson's approach to Reconstruction would clash with many in Congress. While Lincoln had spoken of mercy and rebuilding, Johnson's policies leaned toward leniency for the South, almost to a fault. Radical Republicans, who wanted to see former Confederate leaders punished and full civil rights granted to freed slaves, were deeply suspicious of Johnson. They quickly became at odds with him, sparking tensions that would define the next few years. These battles weren't just political squabbles. They were fights over the soul of the nation. What did freedom really mean? Who would control the new America? And could the wounds of war truly be healed, or would they fester? Johnson's presidency opened a new chapter, one filled with promise but also fraught with peril. Looking back, It's tempting to see Lincoln's assassination as the moment when America's hopes for easy reconciliation died. The shadows of victory loomed long and dark. Yet, those shadows also remind us of the messy, complicated reality of rebuilding a nation. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. Justice isn't a neat checklist. And leadership, well, leadership is messy, full of contradictions, and sometimes heartbreak. The story of this period isn't just politics or history textbooks. It's a story about people, their fears, hopes, failures, and dreams. It's about a nation struggling to make sense of its wounds while trying to find its way forward. And here's a thought. Those struggles haven't disappeared. They echo in our own time, in debates over unity, leadership, and healing after division. So, when you think about the shadows of victory, remember, they aren't just shadows. They're a reminder of how hard it really is to build peace after conflict, and how fragile hope can be. You've probably heard the Civil War called the bloodiest conflict in American history. But numbers only tell part of the story. Over 600,000 lives lost. Imagine that for a moment. It's not just a statistic. It's an ocean of grief, sacrifice, and shattered dreams. This war didn't just carve scars into the land. It reshaped the very soul of a nation. So, where do we even begin to unpack all this? Let's take a stroll through the far-reaching consequences, the staggering human toll, the economic upheavals, the rise of veterans culture, the messy politics of Reconstruction, and finally, how memory itself became a battleground. 600,000. That's the official estimate for Civil War deaths, although some historians suggest it might be even higher. To put in perspective, that's more Americans lost in this single conflict than in all other U.S. wars combined: Revolutionary War, World Wars I and II, Korea, Vietnam, added together. The sheer scale is mind-boggling. But what does that mean beyond the raw figure? Imagine every family in every town, some torn apart, others permanently altered. Fathers, sons, brothers, friends gone, often without a proper goodbye. In the 19th century, news traveled slowly. Many families waited weeks or months, anxious, hoping for letters that never came. Sometimes a soldier's fate remained unknown, lost in the fog of war. Grief became a daily companion for countless Americans. Mourning practices transformed. Communities established makeshift hospitals, and women took on roles that society had never expected of them, nursing the wounded in places that felt more like death houses. The war introduced Americans to a new kind of suffering, one that lingered long after the last shots fired. And the survivors? Many carried physical wounds, crippling injuries that meant a lifetime of pain or dependence. Others battled invisible scars, the psychological trauma that we now call PTSD, but had no name back then. Returning soldiers found it hard to pick up the pieces, grappling with a country trying to heal but struggling to even talk about what had happened. You know what's striking? That loss forced a reckoning with war itself. Americans realized this wasn't just some distant political conflict. It was a brutal, intimate catastrophe. It changed how people thought about warfare, sacrifice, and the meaning of citizenship. It might sound strange, but the war was a sort of crucible, one that shattered old ways, but also forged new paths. The South lay in ruins. Farms burned, cities smoldered, and the entire social order, built on slavery, collapsed overnight. For the first time, the Southern economy faced the harsh reality of a world without enslaved labor. This wasn't just a slow transition, it was an earthquake. Enter sharecropping and tenant farming. The new labor systems that filled the void, but often trapped black and poor white farmers in cycles of debt and poverty. Life for most Southerners became a constant struggle to rebuild, replant, and survive. Up north, it was a different story. While the South burned, the North surged ahead, fueled by booming industry and expanding railroads. Factories cranked out goods at a furious pace, feeding both war efforts and a rapidly modernizing economy. In many ways, the Civil War sped up the transformation from a mostly rural, agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse. And don't forget about women. During the war, with so many men gone, women stepped into roles once considered off-limits. Nursing, clerical work, even managing farms and businesses. Though it wouldn't be immediate, these shifts planted seeds for the women's suffrage movement and greater societal change. It's a paradox, really. Immense human suffering fueling economic progress. Sometimes, history's harshest moments spur innovation and transformation, even as they leave deep wounds. After the guns fell silent, a new chapter began, not of battle, but of memory. Veterans organizations sprang up almost immediately. The Grand Army of the Republic, GR, founded in 1866, became a powerful force, not just socially, but politically. Veterans bonded over shared experiences and sought to honor their fallen comrades. They lobbied for pensions, health care, and Memorial Days. Decoration Day, which later became Memorial Day, originated with these veterans. Communities across the country began decorating soldiers' graves with flowers, turning mourning into public ritual. It was a way to channel grief into meaning, a collective act of remembrance. But it wasn't all unity and healing. Veterans groups sometimes reflected the lingering divisions. Northern and Southern veterans often held separate reunions for decades, each telling their own version of the war story. Through memoirs, speeches, and reunions, veterans helped shape the narrative Americans told themselves about the war. Their stories were powerful, filled with heroism, heartbreak, and a yearning for reconciliation, even as the nation wrestled with the wounds left behind. This culture of remembrance still echoes today. Think about how we honor soldiers, the meaning of Memorial Day, and the monuments that the landscape. It all traces back to those first decades after the Civil War. If you think healing after a family feud is hard, imagine trying to rebuild a nation torn by civil war, politically, socially, and morally. Reconstruction was America's attempt to stitch the country back together, but it was messy, fraught, and far from perfect. The government launched ambitious programs. The Freedmen's Bureau, designed to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, provided education, health care, and legal support. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment aimed to secure voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These were revolutionary steps toward justice. But resistance was fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, using violence and intimidation to maintain control. Southern states passed black codes to restrict freedoms and maintain economic dominance over freedmen. Eventually, Northern interest waned, and Reconstruction ended with many of its promises left unfulfilled. Jim Crow laws would rise, and segregation became entrenched for nearly a century. Yet, despite its failures, Reconstruction laid important legal and moral groundwork. The 14th and 15th Amendments would become tools, often underused but crucial, in the ongoing fight for civil rights. It's a chapter of history that reminds us progress isn't linear, and the fight for justice is ongoing. Here's the thing about history. It's as much about stories as facts. And after the Civil War, competing narratives emerged, shaping how generations would understand the conflict. One of the most persistent is the lost cause myth. This narrative romanticizes the Confederacy, painting Southern soldiers as noble, chivalrous defenders of a way of life, while downplaying slavery's central role. It recasts the war as a fight over states' rights and Southern honor, rather than a brutal defense of human bondage. This mythology spread through Southern literature, monuments, and organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It seeped into school curricula and public ceremonies, reinforcing racial divisions and justifying segregation. On the flip side, Northern and African American perspectives emphasized emancipation, equality, and the fight against slavery. These stories often clashed with lost cause ideals, creating a fractured collective memory. Today, debates over Confederate statues and the way we teach Civil War history reflect these unresolved tensions. Why does it matter? Because how we remember the past shapes our present. our values, our politics, and our sense of identity. Honest remembrance is tough, but necessary if a nation hopes to heal old wounds and move forward. The Civil War's shadow is long and complicated. It was a catastrophe that reshaped lives, economies, and societies, and still echoes in debates, monuments, and memories. Over 600,000 lives were lost, but the cost went far beyond bodies. It altered the very fabric of American life, accelerating industrialization, challenging social hierarchies, and pushing the nation to confront its deepest contradictions. Veterans helped weave a culture of remembrance, try to find meaning amid the loss. Reconstruction sought justice but stumbled amid resistance and setbacks. And the stories we tell ourselves about the war still matter, influencing how we understand race, identity, and history today. Maybe the most important question isn't just what happened, but how we choose to remember and what that memory asks of us.